A war has come that will decide the fate of mankind. An evil creature has risen above the planet. The enemy army is led by a monster who has appeared on Earth from outer space. The monster towers over his army of horrible skeletons with glowing eyes. The evil demon flapped its wings and flew upwards. It soared against a backdrop of continuous lightning bolts. It was a bloodthirsty dragon. At the same time, those called superhumans began to appear among the humans. A huge number of them died fighting, and humanity's victory seemed to be just around the corner. However, the evil monsters would return in another 15 years. So prophesied the Oracle of the Superhumans. An institution for the development of superpowers, called ARC, was created, where children with innate superpowers were placed. These children were being prepared for the final battle with the enemy. The time limit was 3 years. A young man, clenching his fist, with a backpack behind his back, confidently walked towards his intended goal. The man was screaming loudly. His body was engulfed in flames. He was in unbearable pain. The guy opened his eyes and felt that he was in a cold sweat. His gaze was frightened. The guy sitting at the table grabbed his face and cursed. There was that recurring nasty dream again. The young man was wearing a military protective suit. The guy was holding his head and rubbing his hair. There was pain and discontent on his face. The boy opened his eyes and raised his head. He looked at his hands as if he remembered something. He did remember. The last conscripts were arriving today. The helicopter was coming in for a landing. Below was a military naval base. In the helicopter was a young man. He was strapped into the seat with a seatbelt, his hood pulled down over his eyes, and no expression could be seen on his face. The young man was Lee Han, 10 years old, the head of the Saboteur Orphans. The boy was sitting at a long table. On the table in front of him was his personal file. The interlocutor said he was impressed. The interlocutor was a military officer. He told the guy not to be afraid, for he was not going to prison. The gray-haired officer looked down at the young man. The officer asked if Lee Han had heard of the ARC facility. Lee Han interjected, "Did the officer mean the Superhuman Ability Development Facility? Did they really think he was superhuman?" The officer replied that the young man in front of him was a smart kid. The young man is not just superhuman, he is the future savior of mankind. Now he's starting a new life with a roof over his head. He will sleep on a bed. Lee Han said that this life will only be for him alone, not for his brothers. Lee Han said if they want to send him back to ARK, he has a condition. They must take responsibility for his brothers. They must have food, lodging, education. The officer said he understood and agreed. The interlocutor added that he will take personal responsibility for his brothers and will keep it under control. The man added that their contract is valid for exactly as long as he stays in the institution. Lee Han should understand that. With his bag behind his back, Lee Han walked up the ramp of the helicopter. The aircraft landed. The huge transport helicopter landed at the military base. Lee Han stood on the threshold of a new life. There was confidence on Lee Han's face that he had made the right decision. The guy didn't hesitate to walk down the helicopter ramp. The officer said that superpowers were divided into ranks, and Lee Han's rank was low. Each step brought our hero closer to the new, still unexplored in his life. But these were the steps of a confident man. Instructing the guy, the officer told him to do everything to survive if the fate of his brothers was important to him. Lee Han was at his goal. He stood on the doorstep of the ARC Corporation. Our hero's attention was caught by shouts from the crowd. There was a group of guys standing not far away, someone shouting for that brat to go home. Lee Han walked closer. Surrounded by the guys was a girl who was reprimanding the boy who was lying on the ground. The boy had tears in his eyes. The boy, waving his fist, said that because of people like him, they, the conscripts, are looked at as zeros without a stick. The guy continued to sit on the ground. Tears were flowing from his eyes. The guy said he was a real sissy. Someone in the crowd asked the guy, how is he better? Who is he anyway? The guy called them names and turned to face the crowd. He menacingly told them not to compare him to himself. His innards were unattainable to them. The guy's hands and eyes began to glow. Rocks swirled around him. The crowd became frightened and silent. The guy, smiling, said he was an experienced user of superpowers. His eyes and hands were unnatural. The people in the crowd were frightened. They had never seen a real superhuman in action before. The guy held a hovering rock above his hand. He asked the guy lying on the ground if they would send him home if he got maimed. He wouldn't survive in this facility anyway. Tossing the stone up and flashing his eyes, he said that this boy would thank him later. The boy threw a stone in his direction and told him to go home. His eyes glowed unnaturally. Not coincidentally, Lee Han, who was nearby, grabbed the stone and prevented the boy who was sitting on the ground from being injured. Lee Han held the caught rock in his hand. He said that the stone flew somehow slowly. It would have been faster to throw it with his hand. The boy sitting on the ground looked at the stranger in surprise. The guy looked at Li Han in surprise and asked who he was. He didn't expect the guy might have a protector. Li Han let go of the rock and said he was his teacher of good manners. The guy jumped up and grabbed Li Han's head. His opponent took him by the collar. They were about to strike each other with their fists. At that moment, someone cursed loudly. The crowd parted and a young man in a military uniform appeared in front of the brawlers. He wondered what kind of fight was this. The uniformed man told the two men to stand still. The expression on his face did not bode well. The man menacingly asked what their names were. The guy replied in a military manner that he was Del Simon. The opponent calmly said his name was Li Han. The officer asked if Del Simon had been in training and if he had manifested his superpowers. Del replied that only telekinesis. Li Han thought, is that really a superpower? The officer struck Del Simon's stomach with his fist with all his might. The blow was so strong that the guy flew upwards. Del Simon slumped to the ground and ducked in pain. He was out of breath for a while. The officer said that with only one ability awakened, and he was already getting his nose in the air, Del Simon was still out of breath. The officer looked down at the guy and repeated his name, Li Han. The officer said he approved of his tendency to help those who were weaker. Their gazes met. The officer added that if Li Han's abilities were even lower than Del's, he was an even bigger slob. There was no way to avoid the blow. Li Han flew far back and fell to the ground. The officer said that in 3 weeks the first school year would begin. Whoever didn't show any superpowers by then would be expelled. Li Han sat on the ground and held his chest. The officer said he forgot to introduce himself. His name is John Red. He's the instructor. During the training period, he will make these biome trash into fighting superhumans who can defeat the dragon and his army. John Red announced that they start their training, running around the stadium. No stopping until the instructor said, "Stop." The instructor warned that stopping would result in expulsion. Li Han ran as hard as he could. Some cadets fell off their feet and said they had no strength to continue running. The cadets who couldn't run any further were called useless by John Red. He told them to leave the institution immediately and not to disturb others. Li Han, running past, thought that he was used to physical work. Running around in circles is no problem for him. John Red said that those weaklings were expelled. Li Han continued to run. However, what he was worried about at this moment was his superpower. Li Han wondered if he could manifest his superpower like Del Simon did. Li Han continued to run and wondered if he even had any superpowers at all. One of the runners started to slow down, tripped and fell down. He didn't have the strength to keep going. John Red went up to the guy and called him a wuss. He told him he could go home and sleep it off. The guy was lying on the ground and couldn't move. Tears were streaming from his eyes. Li Han went over to the guy and helped him a second time. He lifted him up and told the instructor that this guy didn't say he was giving up. Li Han, supporting his colleague, moved further around the circle with him. The instructor escorted the young men with a glance. At one point, John Red took out his whistle and blew it loudly. He yelled for everyone to stop. The cadets stopped and fell to the ground exhausted. Sweat dripped off them. The instructor said that only 40 of the 73 cadets were left. John Red announced that the warm-up exercises were over for the day. The real training would begin tomorrow. The cadets will do this warm-up every day. All the survivors of this ordeal were terrified. Would they really have to endure this kind of ordeal every day? The next day came. Training began at the ARC institution. The morning run at 5 o'clock. Li Han and Del Simon compete. Breakfast at 8 a.m. Cadets make up for lost calories with great appetite. Morning classes begin at 9 a.m. John Red tells the cadets to find the source of their superpowers with their inner gaze and focus. It can be in the head, sometimes in the heart. Sometimes it can be in the lower chakra. They need to catch the image. Li Han put his hand to his chest and decided to search his heart for the source of his superpowers. At 12:30, the cadets were scheduled to have their midday meal. Li Han picked up the tray of food and chose a place where he could sit down to enjoy his meal. Li Han approached Kuro and asked if he could sit down so they could eat together. Kuro was fine with it. This guy was the first person Li Han had befriended in this establishment. Li Han wished his interlocutor a pleasant appetite. Del Simon came up behind him. Li Han turned around and saw the guy. He too had intended to sit down somewhere. Li Han and Del Simon's gazes met. Simon walked forward. Kuro heard about this guy. He was taking a course for gifted kids in the UK. Li Han replied that in that case, his behavior was understandable. It pissed Li Han off, but that kid really does have superpowers. He hoped that in 3 weeks, he too would learn telekinesis. Kuro said that he could use telekinesis too. Li Han was surprised. Kuro turned out to be a complicated guy. Next came the evening class. Hand-to-hand combat practice, evening jogging. After that, it was shower, dinner, and roll call. Tired cadets fell on their beds. Bedtime was at 22 o'clock. Lee Han lay in bed and couldn't sleep. Shower, food, pillow, blanket, such good conditions Lee Han had never seen in his life. Lee Han was ill-defined whether he wanted to stay here or whether he wanted to go home. Lee Han pulled himself together. He tried to calm himself down. He shouldn't be a wimp. How had 2 weeks gone by? One of the cadets was pleased. He had succeeded. The pencil in his hand was floating in the air. A lot of kids had learned telekinesis by then. Lee Han, no matter how hard he practiced, he couldn't do it. The boy was darker than a cloud. He didn't know what to do. Didn't he have any superpowers? Kuro apologized and said he couldn't help. He didn't know how to learn it. Kuro said there is only one person who knows the theory for sure. Del Simon used to sit on a bench in the park in his spare time. He was just having a conversation with an interlocutor. Simon turned around and asked what he needed. It was obvious on his face that he was not happy about this meeting. Lee Han said that Simon already knew. Del replied that he knows, but Lee Han wants to know the theory. Del Simon looked his interlocutor in the eye and asked why he didn't bow. He thought that Lee Han had been instilled with good manners since childhood. Lee Han thought that his pride had nothing to do with it at all and kneeled down in front of Simon. Lee Han asked that Simon teach him telekinesis and added please. Simon took the pencil from his colleague and told Lee Han to get up. He would teach him now, just so he doesn't complain later. Simon swung sharply and stabbed the pencil right into Lee Han's chest. He cried out in surprise. John Red looked out the window and smoked a cigar. Time flew by quickly. The day of the cadets' enrollment in the ARC Academy had already arrived. The door opened and a man with glasses appeared and said hello to Sergeant Red. The bald man with glasses knew this was where he would find John Red. Red said hello to Octo. Octo grabbed his nose and said that it really stunk in here. He reminded the sergeant that there was no smoking in this room. Red asked why Octo was here. Octo said he decided to stop by the enlistment ceremony and asked Red how he liked the new recruits. Octo said they were a bunch of cannon fodder. Octo wondered, is this really such a joke? John Red said that from his observations, only 2 of them are good for anything. Red added that one is named Del Simon. He's a bad character, but his skills are top-notch. He's at least a year ahead of the program. Octo thought Simon was a brilliant graduate of the Royal Institution for Training Superhumans. He had high expectations for this cadet. About the other one, Red said it was an altruistic type. He has a lot more power in him than the others. He's constantly pulling Kuro along with him. John Red said that this guy is the perfect little soldier. However, there's one little but. The ARC institution needs superhumans, not just people. If there are no superpowers, Lee Han doesn't belong here. Octo said he remembered something. While coming up here, he learned what John Red's name was behind his eyes. Red assumed it was something like son of a bitch. Octo said his interlocutor turned out to be right. At the formation, John Red stood in front of the personnel. He said that today would be the enrollment for the first year of training. The instructor told the cadets not to be deceived. Only those who are ready to use superpowers in combat will be enrolled. John Red said that the simplest superpower is an external effect manifested by the glow of the eyes. The instructor's eyes glowed. If one hasn't learned telekinesis, it doesn't matter. Whoever can do an external effect is enlisted. John Red stated that everyone capable of making an external effect lined up in front of the engineer. He pointed his finger at Octo. Those who can't do it line up on the other side. The agents will take them home by helicopter. Lee Han looked in the direction where the special agents were and saw Major Kang among them. The major stood out among the others. He was wearing a military uniform. The cadets split into 2 groups. The ones who were sad and upset approached the special agents. Lee Han touched his chest. He remembered the moment when Simon stabbed a pencil into his chest. Then right after that, Lee Han had crouched down on the ground in fear. His legs just gave out. Lee Han looked at his chest. His t-shirt was red with blood. Is this really the way to learn? Lee Han, enduring the pain, said that Simon wanted to destroy him. But that's not what he wants. Simon said it's no big deal. It's not a deep wound. One must focus on the pain now. The wound is now his channel of power. Simon crouched down to his interlocutor and told him to pull energy through that wound. This cannot be accomplished without mutilation. Even if he stands for days holding his chest, nothing will happen. Sam would like to return the pencil to the owner. The one refused because the pencil was covered in blood. Lee Han thought that Simon knew that his opponent's source of strength was in his heart. It was from that day that Lee Han finally began to feel his superpower. The guy could feel an inner energy that he had no way of controlling. Something had to be done to make it come out. John Red shouted loudly and called out Lee Han's name. Li Han was the last one left. John Red said so, adding that the guy should get into his formation immediately. Li Han held his chest. He knew he had no turning back. Kuru was worried about his friend and wanted him to do well. John Red, as usual, reprimanded himself and resolutely walked towards the boy. The cadets watched the scene in awe. Sergeant Red walked up to Li Han and said that a soldier must obey the orders of a superior officer. The sergeant swung around and was about to deliver a strong punch with his fist to spur the cadet into action. Li Han gritted his teeth and thought that he had to act right now. They needed to think about how he could respond. Li Han saw a pen sticking out of Sergeant Red's breast pocket. That was what the guy needed right now. As expected, the sergeant threw a punch at the cadet. Li Han flew far backward. Li Han pulled himself up. He had the sergeant's pen in his hand. He couldn't think of anything better to do anyway. Li Han took a swing at the sergeant and raised the pen above his head. The sergeant became even more angry. John Red looked at Li Han with horror. He guessed what the guy was going to do. Li Han thought that the channel of power might not have been opened enough. In a way, Li Han decided to open it and struck his chest with the handle. The blow was very powerful. Del Simon and Kuru cried out when they saw what Li Han had done. Right now, no one expected this from him. John Red grabbed the guy's chest and shouted loudly, "What are you doing? Do you really want to die?" The pen fell out of Li Han's hands and fell to the ground. Drops of blood appeared nearby. John Red let the guy go and said that he had never met such mediocrity before. After taking a few steps, the sergeant turned around. Turning around, he said that at least the guy deserved congratulations. Li Han, eyes wide open, looked at the sergeant. He had the look he needed. Li Han realized that he had been accepted into the institution. Now his journey would begin. Kuru approached his friend and asked how he was feeling. Li Han was sure that he was fine. He said he would heal before the wedding. Octo approached our hero and said he had a gift in honor of his admission. Li Han got something that looked like a watch on his wrist. He asked the engineer what it was. Octo replied that it was the latest gadget he had developed. It's not just a bracelet, it is a device. Information appeared on the gadget that verification was underway. Li Han, conscript. The user registration was completed. Li Han looked at the screen of the gadget and said that it was incredible. Octo said he would teach him how to use it. Sergeant Red shouted that he would now divide the cadets into classes. When he called a rank, the cadet would get up and go to a separate squad. The sergeant explained the ARC grading system, A, B, C, D. The grade is determined by how the cadet performs over a 3-week period. For merit and working hard on their abilities, cadets can increase their rank. John Red said he extends his congratulations to the remaining 25 cadets. They must think he's a son of a bitch. Octo thought this sergeant was pretty vindictive. John Red tells the cadets that he's not just a son of a bitch. He's the meanest son of a bitch they'll ever meet. John Red said, Class A, 1 recruit. That was Del Simon. Class B, 4 recruits. Kuru was one of them. Sergeant Red said these 5 should follow him. Class C, 5 recruits. Class D, 15 people. Li Han realized that he had made it to Class D. He knew that he would still increase his rank. Sergeant Red said that the other 20 were going with Instructor Wei Chung. Instructor Wei Chung was a stern-looking man with a huge stature. The cadets thought that this instructor looked scarier even than Sergeant Red. The man smiled and said that his name was Wei Chung, and he was the weapons instructor. The instructor said that these guys would not be easy, but suggested that they should try their best in a friendly manner. The cadets thought he was kind. The recruits thought they had a good instructor. They were relieved. The sergeant commanded, "Forward march!" Everyone marched to their destination. Cadet Simon led the way. Li Han told Kuru that they would soon be in the same class. Kuru was very excited. It was hard for him without his friend's support. Instructor Wei Chung told all his cadets to go to the gym. In the gym, Wei Chung showed a hand-to-hand combat technique and explained to the cadets what they would be dealing with. The instructor, using a long stick and bare palms, showed the cadets what he would teach them throughout. The instructor was brilliant. Wei Chung said that the cadets must be perplexed as to why they would need to know how to handle spears and swords if they were going to fight a dragon. However, they would need mastery of energy weapons. There is no matter in the world that can hold a mental charge of energy, and only the skin and bones of a dragon can hold and transmit energy. Wei Chung added that only weapons created from dragon components could injure dragons. Li Han asked how the instructor destroyed the dragon if he didn't have such a weapon back then. Wei Chung replied that in that battle, people only fought them in hand-to-hand combat. One dragon destroyed hundreds. Some superhumans worked on the dragon from a distance, but you can only finish a dragon at close range. The task was to deliver a devastating blow with the right weapon to release energy. Such a task was performed by soldiers called strikers. Wei Chung suggested that each of the cadets pick a suitable weapon. Li Han chose the same weapon as the instructor, a long stick that acted as a spear in training. Wei Chung asked Li Han if he liked the spear. The boy replied that it was a weapon he liked. Li Han added that when the instructor demonstrated, he liked the speed and whistle of the spear. Wei Chung thought of this cadet that the calculation and power with which he attacked Sergeant Rita was impossible to overlook. It was obvious from this guy that he had grown up in a very harsh environment. The instructor thought that it was unfortunate that he already had experience in fighting. Wei Chung said that if this guy tried hard, he would help him in everything. Li Han proudly held the training spear, clutching it with both hands. This was the beginning of serious training. 2 weeks had passed. The cadets practiced intensely. The training sessions were held with spears. The current training was especially intense. The opponents didn't want to cede the palma. Li Han said that Jose was already tired. Did he want to give up? Jose replied that he could see that his opponent was saving his strength and was not eager to fight. Li Han deftly knocked the spear out of his opponent's hands. By the end of the second week of training, Li Han was able to defeat the class elder, Jose. The guy put his hands up and said he was giving up. The time came when Li Han finally became the strongest in Class D. The boys thanked each other for the fight. Jose stated that he was being moved to Class C next week. This class will need a new head boy. Jose said that he thinks that Li Han is best suited for that role. He replied that it wasn't up to him. Jose pointed to the boys and said that they are the ones who choose the new class president. They had already discussed everything. Li Han thanked the boys and Jose personally. Li Han thought that if he became class president, he would be one step away from promotion. John Red looked at the guy angrily. It was clear to him without words. The instructor was against Li Han becoming class elder. Li Han, looking up at the instructor from below, thought that he knew the feeling. The seniors in the physical training class were discussing Sergeant Red. One of them had said that the sergeant often made him uncomfortable. He was definitely out of sorts. This time, Sergeant Red was going to fight a freshman. Li Han held a wooden spear without a plug in his hand. The sergeant's hand turned fiery. The effect was so strong that the sergeant lit his cigar from that fire. The cadets cheered the freshman. No one wanted to cheer for the sergeant. Li Han's eyes were burning furiously. The guy realized that he had nothing to lose. He stood in full combat readiness. John Red asked, "Is this chick the only one who wants to be the headman? This kid doesn't even know how to use telekinesis." In the barracks, the sergeant lined up the entire squad in front of him. The cadets were afraid to raise their heads and look him in the eyes. Li Han was the only one looking directly at the sergeant. John Red asked why on earth would he appoint this guy as the headman? Why did they trust him? The sergeant broke the mop with his foot, leaving a pointed stick in his hand. John Red took a swing and threw it to Li Han. The kid caught it. The sergeant said he had been told that Li Han was the best spear fighter in this class. In that case, he should fight him. Li Han held a broken mop in his hand and wondered, "Is it really this? But this stick is too sharp." The sergeant asked, "Does this boy think he can injure him with a sharpened stick with his puny skills?" It was after this conversation that the duel was to begin on the plaza in front of the dormitory. The sergeant tossed his jacket aside. Li Han wondered, would the opponent really fight in hand-to-hand combat? The sergeant said that he would not have any weapons. Does Li Han really think he needs a spear to fight a child? John Red said the rules are simple. If any part of his body touches the ground, like his elbow or knee, then the kid wins. Li Han asked what the rules were for him. The sergeant replied that if Li Han gave up, he lost. Li Han confidently said that in that case, he would definitely not lose. Li Han, preparing for the fight, began to slowly rotate the wooden stick in his hands. The sergeant adopted a boxing stance. The classmates began to discuss the fight. This boy has good training. Is he really going to fight the sergeant? He's almost impossible to beat. Del Simon walked by. Simon shushed the boys and told them to get out of the way and let him pass. Simon looked out of the window and thought that this Li Han was really crazy. Li Han thrust his spear forward, shouted, and rushed forward to attack. The boy began to strike his opponent with his stick. John Red, putting up his hands, easily blocked these attacks. Li Han sprinted and jumped up and tried to attack his opponent from above. The sergeant still blocked this attack with ease. After knocking the stick out of his opponent's hands, John Red grabbed the boy's chest and kicked him in the stomach. Li Han fell to the ground and grouped himself and tried to defend himself from the blow. John Red swung his foot at the boy and was about to hit him. At the last moment, Li Han grabbed a stick and somersaulted to avoid being hit by his opponent's leg. The boy jumped to his feet and leaned on the stick, screaming. Fear appeared in his eyes. Did the sergeant really mean to destroy him? John Red wondered why the boy was looking at him like that. Dragon and his army destroy everyone. They don't look at age. The sergeant added that he won't do the boy any favors, even if he knows he is weak. The dragons also destroy anyone who gets in their way. The sergeant added that if Li Han were to face an enemy army, the current situation would seem insignificant to him. Li Han rose to his feet and put his stick forward, asking if Sergeant Red would fight or just talk. The sergeant swung and said that apparently the guy had already recovered. The sergeant grabbed the young man by the chest and lifted him high up with one hand. John Red threw his opponent to the ground with force. The boy, tumbling, flew far forward. Li Han fell to the ground and was hit painfully. The impact was so strong that he even somersaulted a few times. Li Han immediately got to his feet and grabbed the bruised area with his hand. His head was very sore. The sergeant noticed that his cheek was cut and blood was gushing out of the wound. The boys watching the fight favored Li Han and shouted words of encouragement to him. Li Han gathered his strength, jumped high up, and swung his spear. The sergeant thought he should take a closer look at his opponent's movements. Blood continued to flow out from the wound. Li Han made a nimble and quick movement and was behind his opponent. Li Han jumped up again and swung his stick and tried to attack the sergeant. The sergeant noticed this and managed to dodge. John Red thought that this guy was agile due to his good command of the centrifugal force of his body. Li Han was indeed very fast and agile in moving around the court. The sergeant thought, so there was a reason why Wei Cheng was praising him so much. The sergeant was beginning to like this guy too. John Red, who was in a boxing stance, decided to meet his opponent with a punch. Li Han hit the sergeant as hard as he could and broke the stick against him. The pointy tip lodged in the sergeant's chest. Li Han squatted in front of his opponent. The formidable sergeant grabbed the stick sticking out of his chest and pulled it out. Blood dripped even more intensely. The sergeant was furious. He grabbed the young man by the throat and lifted him above him. John Red asked if maybe the boy wanted to be finished off. The sergeant looked into his opponent's eyes and told Li Han to give up. His gaze was eloquent. The sergeant's hand holding the boy was covered in fire. Li Han screamed and gasped. The cadets watching this scene thought that Sergeant John Red had completely lost his mind. Del Simon didn't utter a word. The sergeant's eyes burned furiously. The hand holding the boy was on fire. He told Li Han to surrender or be destroyed. Li Han, panting, whispered that he would not surrender even if the sergeant destroyed him. Through the ranks of the cadets, Instructor Wei Cheng was making his way. John Red continued to hold the boy's throat with his flaming hand. Wei Cheng shouted for Sergeant Red to stop immediately. Wei Cheng ran to Li Han's aid. He shouted, "Does the sergeant really want to destroy the boy?" The sergeant said that this boy did not surrender, but he did not knock him down either. This is a dilemma. Wei Cheng took the boy in his arms and asked, "How will this fight end?" Wei Cheng angrily said that he was already fed up with the ARC methods. John Red watched his colleague carefully. Sergeant Red bent down and picked up his jacket. The t-shirt he was wearing was torn and covered in blood. The sergeant turned to the personnel and yelled for everyone to shut up immediately. John Red announced that if the boy didn't surrender, he would win. The boys listened to him with bated breath. Sergeant Red told Wei Wen to stop babysitting this boy. It's inappropriate. Del Simon thought that this boy was capable of overcoming difficulties. Jose said he had proved it. The sergeant walking away said when this boy is cured, we should send him straight to Class B. My colleague was surprised. He should go straight to Class B. He replied that he was putting this guy on the promotion list today. The interviewee asked what the management would say about this. Is it possible to go from D to B? The sergeant said he thinks this guy is quite ready for Class A. The only thing stopping him is his poor energy potential. The interviewer said that's the first thing management looks at. Sergeant Red smugly said that management doesn't understand anything. When the hour of battle with the dragon comes, what they need is not some magic, not energy, but steely will and courage that will help them not only hold their weapons and not be afraid, but also deal critical damage. In that respect, Li Han has a good chance of being the best striker they've ever raised. They can't afford to miss out on such a talent just because his energy potential is slowly developing. Suddenly, this simple boy the sergeant singled out will save humanity? The girl noticed that she had never heard the sergeant praise a disciple before. It seemed to her that this Li Han annoyed him. John Red said that on the contrary, he liked this guy. The interviewee admitted that Sergeant Red is a real sadist. It was the 7th day of sick leave. The girl inquired if Instructor Wei would be stopping by. The instructor looked around and realized he had been seen. He said hello. The girl inquired what was in his hands. In the basket. The instructor said he was taking food for a convalescent. The girl came closer and said to Wei Cheng, in that case, don't be shy and come through. Wei Cheng said that he thought it was better not to disturb for now and showed the girl through the window what the ward patient was doing. Li Han was sitting at a table and there was a glass ball in front of him. The guy was developing his telekinesis skills. The ball wouldn't budge. Li Han was tense. Droplets of sweat appeared on his face. His hands were under tremendous tension. The orb lifted a few millimeters above the surface. Li Han continued to stubbornly stare at the glass ball. The object slowly rose higher and higher, and now the orb was already at the level of the young man's chest. His hands still felt the same tension. The boy had succeeded. Wei Chung and the girl bumped palms together. They were happy for Li Han. The young men came to their senses and turned away from each other, embarrassed. The girl coughed. She told the instructor to pass. Wei Chung scratched the back of his head and thought that the boy had excellent concentration. The instructor knocked and opened the door. Li Han didn't get distracted and continued to push. The balloon continued to hang in the air. Wei Chung said hello to the young man and asked how he was feeling. Only then did Li Han notice the guest, smiled, and greeted him. The boy said that he felt much better thanks to instructor Wei Chung. The man put the basket on the floor and said that he had brought some food. Li Han smiled and thanked him. Wei Chung said that the boy would continue his studies in Class B tomorrow and added that he was proud of his achievements in telekinesis. Li Han didn't waste any time in vain, even while in his hospital bed. Li Han recognized that his energy potential was low, so he decided to tighten up his telekinesis while he recuperated. The instructor was peeling an apple with a knife and praised Li Han. He said that wielding a weapon wasn't everything for a superhuman. One must have at least some level of telekinesis. The fight with the enemy would be mostly in the air, and the guy would definitely need the ability to catch a weapon with telekinesis if it was knocked out of his hands. The woman on duty wondered, how could anyone leave the hospital at a time like this? Wei Chung said that they wouldn't be gone long at all. Li Han wondered why Instructor Wei brought him to the gym at this hour. The instructor said that he was concerned about this cadet's psychic development. From what he saw, his chances of awakening the ability were very slim. Wei Chung said that his peers already possessed fire and teleportation. However, it was better for Li Han to give up hope of such achievements. The boy looked at his instructor warily. If Li Han is wondering how he should fight, the answer is surprisingly simple. Li Han should put all his hard work into developing telekinesis. And then telekinesis might very well become his superpower. Li Han thought, is it really to train telekinesis? Wei Chung said that a superpower was like a muscle. With that, the instructor moved around on sticks floating in the air. The division of recruits into ranks is nothing more than a convention. This generation has immeasurably more potential than the adults. Wei Chung, smiling, told the kid to work up a sweat and then he would be lucky. Encouraged by the instructor's demeanor and speech, as well as the hope that everything would work out, Li Han said that he would do as Wei Chung tells him. After the hospital room, Li Han came to a new class, Class B. After crossing the threshold, our hero was confronted by a classmate who was 2 heads taller than him. The older guy looked down on the newcomer from above and asked, "Who are you? Is it really Li Han?" Li Han was surprised. Does he really know him here? The interlocutor replied that everyone here knew him. The young man extended his hand to our hero and said it was nice to meet him. He is the head of Class B, Dmitry Vladimirovich Petrov. Li Han was surprised. Is that really what they call him? The headman replied that he could just be called Dima. He hoped for friendship and fruitful cooperation. Dima said that Li Han came just in time. It was free time for training and suggested that he follow him. Li Han thought with a disgruntled look that he adored training. The daily regimen was stifling in its monotony. Li Han's ability was low compared to others, and it was always an added stress. The sword of Damocles of expulsion was constantly hanging over him. The only activities where a guy could completely blow off steam was training. Here, Li Han could always let loose and show what he can do. Li Han really showed outstanding results during his spear training. After training, he would ask his opponents, did they really come here to have fun? There was no equal to him. Kuro's superpower was his energy potential. After another training session, Li Han asked his coworkers, are they having fun spitting on those less capable than them from above? The guys should be thankful that competing in martial arts is not part of the mandatory training program. Dima, looking at the results of this training, was surprised. Petrov thought that this guy was even stronger than he expected. Finally, there was someone he could fight with from the heart. One of the cadets picked up a wooden sword and told Kuro to get up and attack him. His colleague pushed him away and stated that it was his turn. Another cadet came up and said he would be the third. Kuro mentally called out to Li Han for help. The 3 cadets asked, what's the matter? Unexpectedly, the suddenly appeared Li Han didn't hesitate and went into battle alone against the 3. He didn't even give his opponents time to recover. Kuro, standing on all fours with tears in his eyes, couldn't believe that Li Han had actually stood up for him. 1 against 3. Li Han stood resolutely in front of Kuro, facing his opponents. With his whole appearance, he made it clear that he would not leave his friend in trouble. Li Han asked Dmitri, "Does he really call this healthy competition?" Dmitri said it's called ARC. The enemy will spare no one because there is no place for the weak here. Dmitri added that Li Han is special here, but right now he's doing Kuro a bearish favor. Li Han was determined. Dmitri added that it wouldn't do any good in the future. Li Han realized that Dmitri was right and there was no arguing with him. However, he couldn't leave his friend in distress and not react to the injustice. Dmitri said that to be fair, it wasn't fair for 3 people to attack one. The 3 attackers sat on the floor and scratched their bruised spots. Dmitri suggested that Li Han show the audience a real fight. Li Han, still calm and clutching the wooden spear tightly in his hand, said that he didn't mind. Dmitri immediately swung and tried to strike Li Han with his sword. Li Han blocked this blow with his spear. However, if you blocked a spear strike 2 times in a row, it might break. The attacker decided to distract his opponent first, and then knock him down. Li Han dodged and took advantage of the moment to deliver a strong spear strike to his opponent's chest. After another lunge of Li Han, Dmitri dodged the blow and came close to his opponent. The attack ended with Li Han lying on his back, having dropped the spear from his hands. Dmitri crouched with his sword in his hand next to him. Li Han was indignant. Why was his opponent hitting his head? This is martial arts, not a street fight. Dmitri told Li Han to watch out for more than just weapons. He started practicing Sambo as soon as he learned to walk. If Li Han gets him, he won't pick a bone next time. Li Han, rising to his feet and leaning on his spear, asked if Dmitri was going to defeat the dragon with Sambo techniques too. Dmitri replied that if necessary, he was ready to strangle the dragon with his bare hands. The cadets started cheering Dmitri and cheering for him. They shouted that he was a tiger cub from Siberia. Dmitri turned around and said that he hasn't been a tiger cub for a long time. This is silly. Li Han saw the people present cheering for his opponent, and it only made him even angrier. Li Han looked at these guys and thought, even though they are insulting each other, they don't mean it. These guys had grown attached to Dmitri, and it was noticeable. Kuro stood to the side with his head down sadly. He was holding on to his injured arm. Dmitri shouted for Li Han to stop ogling around and get ready to fight. The opponents adopted fighting stances. Li Han didn't want to drag out the fight, so he attacked first. He lunged forward with his spear, but Dmitri dodged. Li Han jumped high up and planned to deliver a powerful blow that would put an end to this battle. However, Dmitri ducked again. The opponents moved around the court, initiating attacks, but their attacks were not successful. Once again, the clash of weapons caused the wooden spear and sword to shatter into splinters. Li Han thought that his opponent wanted to break his spear from the beginning. Turning around, Li Han saw Dmitri moving towards him with his bare hands. Was it really hand-to-hand combat? Dmitri grabbed his opponent and threw him up and started pinning him to the ground. Not expecting such a thing, Li Han even flipped in the air. Dmitri threw his opponent to the floor and grabbed his arm, performing a painful hold. The people watching only encouraged Dmitri. He told Li Han to give up or his arm would be broken. Li Han did not give up and through his teeth said that Dmitri could try to realize what he had planned. Petrov thought, is this guy so self-confident? Those watching froze with horror on their faces. Silence reigned. The crunch of breaking bones was heard and Li Han cried out loudly in pain. Dmitri stood up and stepped aside. Li Han was lying on the floor, writhing in pain. Petrov said as he offered to surrender. He only got his hands dirty. Kuro was the most worried of those watching. He had tears in his eyes again. He was afraid for his friend. Petrov said that it is amazing. This guy does not cry because of the fracture. Good for him. Winner said to have someone take the injured man to the medical center. However, Li Han didn't need help at the moment. He was standing with a broken spear in his hand behind Dmitri. With all his strength, Li Han brought the spear fragment down on his opponent and said that apparently all his opponents were just shedding tears because of this. Dmitri was stretched out on the floor from that blow. Li Han told him to get to his feet because they weren't done yet. Li Han looked at the spear fragment in his hand. The stick had gotten even shorter. He broke his opponent's head with it. Dmitri was lying on the floor with foam coming out of his mouth. He didn't even move. When Dmitri opened his eyes, he saw a white ceiling in front of him. The boy was lying in a hospital room. Dmitri jumped up from the bed. He couldn't understand what was wrong and even shrieked. On the next bed with a bandaged hand sat Li Han. He was just having a video call session with a gadget on his wrist. The interlocutors said that Li Han had exceeded all their expectations. Thanks to him, his younger brothers are perfectly fine. The man promised to send a video from them next time. This time, Li Han saw a picture showing his 3 brothers and an officer. The interlocutor said goodbye and said he had to go now. Li Han was satisfied. His brothers were really doing well. Their faces became round and happy. Lihan turned his attention to Dmitri and said that he was already awake. Dmitri had a wound on his head that was covered with a band-aid. A surprised Dmitri pointed his finger at the gadget and asked what was that even now. Dmitri moved closer and began to poke his finger at the gadget on Lihan's wrist. He didn't realize what he was even doing. Lihan reminded him that this guy had broken his arm. Dmitri said that after that confrontation, he had a crack in his head. After all, Lihan had attacked him from behind like the ultimate coward. Lihan replied that it was Dmitri's own fault. Why did he set himself up like that? It's called ARC, because Dmitri said so himself. Lihan said he was angry then, but not at Dmitri. Dmitri said he was angry too, but he will win next time anyway. Lihan expressed his belief that Kuro should not have been treated like that. He should have reached out to him instead of getting into a fight. Dmitri replied that he knew what he was talking about, but when they got to the second year, they might get killed. Lihan wondered what he was talking about. This was the first time he had heard of it. Dmitri stood up and led Lihan behind him. Lihan wondered where they were rushing to. Petrov replied that it was easier to show than tell. Petrov brought Lihan to another department and said that this is the intensive care unit. Here they say, if the patient is breathing, he will be saved. There was a patient in the ICU in a terrible condition. There were doctors around him. The man had an oxygen mask on his face, and he had many wounds. Lihan felt frightened and surprised. He didn't understand what it was now. Dmitri asked if he now realized how dangerous training could be. He was a senior student. Lihan wondered if the guys from the next level weren't their peers. That man clearly looked older. Lihan added that this injured man looked more like an instructor than a student. Petrov explained that when cadets move on to the second course, they start being given drugs and the body undergoes structural changes. Dmitri added that the cadet begins to grow rapidly and the body becomes like an adult's. Lihan was horrified by what he heard. Dmitri wondered, had Lihan forgotten that in their third year they would have to fight a dragon? The government wouldn't wait for them to grow up naturally, Lihan thought to himself. He had always wanted to become an adult. He had to do many things to survive. Lihan remembered when he was a kid he used to practice stealing and once stole a bag from a passerby. Lihan wanted to become an adult also in order to stand up to those who were older. After he stole that bag, he was grabbed by bandits who were older than him. The bandits hit the guy in the jaw with their fist and he flew far back. The miscreants beat up Lihan badly that time. The boy then remained lying on the ground bleeding, and the bandits left with that bag. He really wanted to become an adult. Lihan said he didn't need a happy childhood. Surviving is the most important thing. Dmitri said that his interlocutor was definitely the most mature in RK. Lihan replied that he understood what Dmitri was talking about. Now it's safe to go back. The next day, the new instructor announced that today would be air training. The red headgear looked funny on him. The instructor warned that the cadets had to do everything they had been taught. Backpacks and air helmets were laid out on the formation. Cadets should check their belongings beforehand. Departure is at 4:30 p.m. Dmitri said that they were just released from the hospital and they are going up in the air right away. Doesn't Lihan miss his hospital bed? Our hero was interested in everything. This was a new experience he wanted to have. Lihan, patting the backpack on his chest, said that there was a lot of food in this bag. Why so many supplies? Our hero assumed that they had a challenging aerial training ahead of them. The instructor is not saying something. Petrov looked around and said that some had already opened their rations, and it looked shameful. Dmitri tapped his neighbor on the shoulder and told Lihan to look to his right. A little to the side alone sat Del Simon. The guy was focused and thoughtful. Dmitri said he was the last genius of England, and thought he wouldn't mind having a fight with him. The instructor in the red cap shouted loudly for the cadets to stop fiddling and quickly load aboard the aircraft. The cadets donned their helmets and moved to board the aircraft. Backpacks and parachutes were with them. The loading of the cadets took place in the tail of the helicopter. Everyone quickly ran in and took their seats on board. Each of the cadets was met by an instructor. He scrutinized the uniforms and checked the equipment. After all the cadets were loaded, the helicopters took to the air. The air operation had begun. John Red thought he was wiping the snot out of these mama's boys for the last time. The guy had thought when he first saw Lihan that he wasn't like the others. Subsequently, his abilities confirmed that assumption. But now he was unable to help, no matter how much he waited for it. Kuro was once again covered in tears. He really needed help. He was all alone now. After landing from the helicopter at the moment of landing, Kuro's parachute got caught on a tree. And now the guy was hanging on the parachute slings, unable to free himself. An hour earlier, the helicopters had left the naval base and headed for their destination. The cadets anxiously waited for the signal to disembark, sitting in their seats. The instructor calmly watched them. This was everyday life for him. From up here, the ARC buildings appeared very small. The navigation instruments showed that the helicopters were flying over an uninhabited island. The purpose of training on this island was to be able to survive. Sergeant Red announced that the provisions in the backpacks should be enough for 2 days. After that, the cadets would have to solve their own subsistence problems. The cadets were frightened when informed that the goal was the same, to survive. How can they stay on a desert island for 2 days? Dimitri said it was interesting, almost like a Boy Scout camp. John Red announced to everyone that the instructors would be back for them in a week. The cadets freaked out. Why were the groceries only for 2 days? The sergeant added that they should try not to starve to death by then. Sergeant Red fished one of the cadets out of the water. The guy was choking. Apparently it was a bad landing. Red asked a colleague in a red cap, "Is that the last one?" The coworker, looking at a holographic map of the island, said no one else had given up. On the map, dots marked the cadets' landing sites. He said that the recruits were distributed evenly across the island. The colleague added that the 7 then merged into one group. John Red said that the lads weren't so harmless, just like adults. If you leave them unchecked, they'll just start solving things by force. And instead of working together for survival, they'll rob each other. In fact, it did happen. It involved a group of 7. One of the cadets who robbed a colleague said that the supplies would last for at least a few more days. The robbers looked at the backpack and rejoiced. The supplies hadn't been used up yet. They hadn't even been touched. One of the villains shoved his coworkers away and said he would take the rest to the boss, and told Carl to pay attention. Another member joined these robbers and called them names. He was displeased with their behavior. They said they were going to look for food until the sun went down, while they were doing something else. The bandits looked at the boss. The boss asked in surprise, did they really think he had gathered them all together to have a dinner together? The guy explained that it was to make sure that no one could overpower them. The expression on his face said that he would not tolerate dissenters in his squad. His companions gave him a friendly cheer and shouted that they would scatter everyone, no matter who was in front of them, no matter if it was Dimitri or Lee Han. Together they could handle even Del Simon. Suddenly the group heard cries for help. They were coming from somewhere from behind the trees. Everyone listened to it. The boss of the group looked in the direction where the sounds were coming from. It was not far away at all. He was curious, and they decided to head there. He told his squad that their next victim was in that direction according to the video, so they all moved in unison to get there. At the same time, another cadet was coming out of the water on the coast. Apparently, he'd gone straight in after the helicopter and didn't dry the water. It was Lee Han who stepped onto the island. He said he lost a lot of time getting to the shore. Lee Han looked around and thought it was a good place to set up camp. Our hero decided first of all to find shelter. To do that, he must find a suitable place. For someone who had been starving all his childhood, the food left for 2 days would be more than enough. Lee Han, with his backpack on his back, searched for a suitable place to camp. He was advancing deep into the interior of the island. Lee Han knew that in such a situation, many competitors would start taking food from the weaker ones. He wondered if that was what Simon and his kind were doing. Simon was a lone wolf and didn't team up with anyone. He, just like the others, decided to find a place to set up camp. Dmitry Petrov appeared in Simon's path. Simon asked what he wanted. This meeting did not bode well. There was excitement in Petrov's eyes. He said that Simon's genius was in front of him and offered him a fight. Simon, showing no interest, turned around and said that he did not want to waste his energy on this worthless activity. Petrov called out to him. Dmitry said that Simon misunderstood him. He didn't want to break up this way and added that he had a purely sporting interest. Simon stopped and thought that his interlocutor was acting like a sick person. Petrov, hesitating, continued. Maybe they could have a little chat. His suggestion did seem a little strange in this situation. Petrov tagged along behind Simon. Simon thought that this guy was a real bore. The sun was nearing sunset. The squad leader said that they were getting close. The guy looked up and said that they had finally arrived at the place they were looking for. In front of the squad of cadets, Kuro was hanging from a tree and begging for help with tears in his eyes as always. He had never been able to free himself from the parachute hanging from the tree. The others laughed. Did this guy really like hanging around? Kuro's rucksack with provisions went to the cadets. They smilingly thanked Kuro for the food. The squad turned around and after saying goodbye began to leave. Kuro, still crying, told them to stop and leave him some provisions. The leader of the group said that if Kuro hadn't been hanging from the tree, he might have gotten a kick in the head from them, so he was just lucky. He could keep hanging there and wait for the instructors. Laughing, they said he probably wouldn't starve to death in a week. They clearly had no intention of freeing the guy from the tree. The guy doomedly continued to hang in the tree. They told him that if it rained, he wouldn't die of thirst either. Kuro thought that these cadets had turned out to be very mean. Night came. Kuro was still hanging in the tree and still crying. Kuro remembered how they bullied him at camp and told him to stop crying. His tears pissed everyone off. Many of the cadets at school recognized Kuro as a weakling and constantly mocked him. All he could hear was people yelling at him to shut up and stop crying. Everyone who mocked him said that guys shouldn't cry over such nonsense. Dmitry Petrov felt that way too. And now Kuro was hanging on a tree at night and kept crying. From fatigue, the cadet's eyes began to slip. He began to dream that Lee Han had appeared on the ground in front of him. He thought of this guy as his savior. Kuro opened his eyes and the mirage disappeared. He had only seen Lee Han. This was his wish at this moment. If Lee Han appeared here, he wouldn't laugh and would definitely help him. However, this was not a miracle. Lee Han actually appeared and saw his friend hanging from the tree. Lee Han came out of the thicket. "Who's that there?" Naturally, he didn't expect to see Kuro hanging from a tree. Lee Han was sitting on the lawn near the hut he had built and was using a knife to sharpen a stick. He needed a tool for the upcoming hunt. Kuro came out of the hut. There was a look of surprise in the boy's eyes. It turns out he's on the loose. Kuro spent some time in the hut resting and recovering. At the same time, Lee Han was not idle and acted according to the plan. Seeing his comrade, Lee Han smiled and said hello. He said, "Finally, Kuro, awake." Kuro said his friend's name in surprise, Lee Han. Still, he was lucky this time. Lee Han offered his friend some of the food from his provisions and told him that breakfast was ready for him. Lee Han told the boy that he couldn't find his bag under the tree, so he was willing to share his rations with him. Kuro thought that there was hardly enough food for one. He hated being a burden, but he was still hungry. Kuro thanked his friend for the food and the rescue. He thought to himself that he was a pathetic weakling and a burden to Lee Han. Kuro felt uncomfortable and once again thanked his friend for saving him. Lee Han said that it would be a good idea for them to look for a water source. Observation drones appeared above the lawn where Lee Han had set up his shawl. The drones were also circling over the 7-man squad. The information from these drones was received at the headquarters. In this case, it was John Red who was watching what was happening from the screens. A man entered the room where the sergeant was and said that smoking was not allowed here. This was Engineer Octo. Octo said the sergeant was trying to seem cool and also turned off the lights. Did he find anyone interesting? The sergeant with a cigar in his teeth said there was one cadet who was sick in the head and suggested that the interviewer look at it himself. On the screen was one of the cadets who thought a week on a habitable island was a complete nonsense. He had put a basket over his head to hide from the scorching sun. This cadet was Nud Meyer from Norway. He had built himself a raft and was returning to the ARC. Lee Han and Kuro found a source of fresh water and poured it into a bottle with purifying filters and drank to their heart's content. Lee Han told his comrade that after they had drunk the water, they would continue their journey onward. Because of the scorching sun, Lee Han said that walking during the day had become more difficult. He suggested that they find shelter for now. Kuro was fine with that. Lee Han realized that they needed to get food so that both of them would have enough for the remaining time. The sun continued to scorch. It was unclear if there was anything edible on this island. Not even coconuts could be seen. Lee Han assumed that the cadets would start stealing food from each other. Suddenly, Kuro grabbed his comrade's arm and anxiously told him to stop immediately. However, Lee Han continued on by inertia and stepped on a branch, which crunched under his foot and made a corresponding sound. Right in front of the cadets was a well-disguised trap. Pulling apart the camouflage grass, the boys saw a deep hole. It was a trap where one could safely dislocate a leg. Lee Han asked in surprise how Kuro knew about it since he hadn't been here yet. Lee Han was surprised because Kuro couldn't have seen the trap being prepared. Kuro looked at him confused and didn't know how to explain it to him so that he would understand. Kuro began to rotate his hands strangely in front of him, his eyes as if hypnotized. He said that as he approached this pit, everything in front of his eyes began to spin. Lee Han thought that Kuro was not delirious, so he was after all. Lee Han speculated that perhaps it was a vision. This is a useful and cool power his comrade has. You just have to know how to use it properly. Bypassing the trap, the cadets moved on. Lee Han thought that Kuro had gotten excited and his powers had awakened. Lee Han thought that this assignment would help Kuro develop his abilities. We just need to push him to do it. At this time, strangers approached Lee Han's hut. They couldn't pass by such a find. The leader of the group looked inside. He examined the contents of the hut with an experienced eye. The guy determined that there were 2 people living in this hut. They were clearly in the minority. There were no bags in the shack, so these 2 men took them with them. Turns out there's nothing to eat here. One of the cadets, knuckles kneading, said we should kick these 2 guys' asses. The leader suggested they couldn't have gotten far, probably looking for water. The guy said they'd come here later, would attack them the moment they were resting. Kuro kept moving with his last strength. The boy was physically much weaker than his companion. He couldn't wait for them to have another rest. Li-Han said that they would rest when they returned to the camp. Kuro sighed and said that he really wanted to lie down. Li-Han, as they approached their camp, looked at the ground and stopped. It was a surprise to him. Li-Han crouched down on his knee, took a rock in his hand, and said that there was someone in their camp. Li-Han stated that before he left at the entrance, he left the stone as a marker. Now he sees that this stone has been moved from its place. Stones do not move themselves. In addition to the stone, there were many human footprints in front of the shack. There were at least 2 of them. After looking back and looking to the side, Li-Han determined that there were many more people. Li-Han said aloud that the more people in a group, the easier it was to rob others. We should fold up the tent and leave. Kuro sadly agreed since he hadn't gotten any rest. After packing up the tent and packing all of their belongings, our heroes moved off in search of a new place to set up camp. The sun was slipping towards sunset. Li-Han said that it was necessary to find a place to camp before it got dark. Li-Han asked Kuro if he could see anything. Kuro replied that he didn't feel well. His eyes were closing and his voice sounded unnatural. Li-Han looked at his companion. Kuro's eyes had become somehow detached and frightened again. Kuro, against the backdrop of the blazing flames, saw a wild predator sneaking right at him. In the next instant, that predator had already lunged at Li-Han. It looked like a nightmare. Kuro opened his eyes and immediately forcefully pushed Li-Han away from him. After dropping the stick from his hands, Li-Han flew backwards and fell on his back. In the next instant, a wild black panther jumped onto the spot where Li-Han had just stood. It appeared right in between the cadets. The panther, flashing its eyes, turned around and slowly began to approach Li-Han. The guy sitting on the ground started to stagger backwards. Li-Han was horrified to think that his spear was lying aside. He was practically unarmed. The wild cat was getting closer and closer. However, the unexpected happened. The panther screamed loudly as if something had happened to it. Li-Han even closed his eyes in fear. Suddenly, there was a bright flash and something that looked like lightning struck directly at the panther. Li-Han saw the panther jump up, dash into the bushes, and run away further into the forest. The guy looked back to the place where the attack on the panther had come from. Li-Han saw Jose standing beside him. The cadet who had suddenly appeared had used his superpowers and used fire to drive the panther away. Jose asked Li-Han if he was okay. Jose looked in the other direction and saw that Kuro was also present, so there were already 3 of them. Li-Han noticed that Jose's leg was bandaged. Could it be that he was injured? Jose, looking at his leg, explained that he was trapped by some jerks. Honestly, he was still having a hard time standing. Jose sat down on the ground and said that it was good that they met. Now they have a real grouping. Kuro informed his friend that Jose had told him about the trap. Li-Han replied that it must be the same cadets who came to see them as well. Jose said that he knew someone would start robbing others, but he didn't even have food, so he had nothing to take. Li-Han wondered why he didn't have any food. Jose explained that as soon as he was trapped, he ate everything. When he heard Jose's answer, Li-Han thought, is he really that stupid? However, they had to find a place to sleep. At night, a fire was burning in a clearing in the forest. Around it, the cadets were resting in their sleeping bags. Only their leader was awake. The guy did not sleep. He watched the fire and remembered his story, how he ended up in the ARC. His father told him that a detector went off at the airport during the inspection. It seems his son is superhuman. He has telepathic abilities. The father, looking Carl in the eye, said this is a chance for his son. He should join the ARC. Carl wondered, what about filming the movie? The father officially said that Karl Heinz would develop his gift and quit clowning. He would have fame and fortune without the circus on camera. The man said that telepaths will make national history when the war is over. He is given the opportunity to be the one to rule an entire nation. That's how Karl Heinz found himself in front of the ARC building. Looking at those 3 letters, the guy even swore. Sitting on the grass, Del Simon watched Dmitry Petrov doing push-ups from the ground on one arm. This exercise was not easy. Simon wondered if Petrov had any strength left. Dmitry was sweating, but he didn't give up. Simon, as if mocking, ate an energy bar and coldly watched his opponent. After milking the energy bar, Del Simon said there was no more food. Is Petrov really going to starve for 5 days? Petrov said smugly that he's an athlete and should be able to handle adversity. To be a good fighter, you have to train hard. Simon noticed that telepaths don't fight on their fists. Petrov thought that he missed Li Han. Besides Simon, he had no one else to practice his fighting skills with. Simon was surprised. Did Petrov really fight with Li Han? From the surprise, his hair even became hazy, and his eyes lit up. Petrov rejoiced. Finally, this Simon reacted to his words. Petrov mentally thanked Li Han. Now he could compete in strength with this Simon. In a successfully hidden from prying eyes, cave appeared shelter for the cadets. There was even light inside. A fire was burning in the cave. Around it were Jose, Kuro, and Li Han. They were warm and dry here. Li Han suggested that they stay together for the rest of the time. Li Han said that he would go with Kuro to look for both food and firewood. At the same time, Jose would stay behind to watch the shelter if his leg still hurt. Li Han added that thanks to Jose's pyrokinesis, they had a good chance of surviving this training. Jose could control fire. There were fish swimming in the river. They were candidates to be cooked for the next meal. After estimating their size, Li Han said they were good for eating, so this fish should be taken out of the water. Kuro asked his friend if he knew how to fish because he was not a master. Li Han thanked Kuro. The boy looked at his friend questioningly. He didn't understand what he was being thanked for. Li Han for saving him yesterday and also finding them shelter. All thanks to Kuro's superpower. Li Han thought that he should take care of Kuro. However, he realized that he couldn't do that forever, especially after seeing the injured senior in the ICU. Therefore, Li Han didn't know what to do. Li Han said that here on the island, he saw that Kuro is a telepathy genius. He has real superpowers. Li Han added that Kuro has the abilities to protect them all. He suggested that they help each other from now on. Kuro, naturally, was fine with that. They were friends after all, and he was always willing to help his friend as much as he could. Kuro remembered himself as a child. He was an orphan from Japan who didn't even have a name. His skin was swarthy, so he was called Kuro. However, his peers constantly made fun of the fact that Kuro cried regularly. Kuro thought that now he had someone he could trust. Looking at the fishing results, Li Han excitedly said that it was much cooler than he expected. Kuro stared intently at the fish floating in the water. Only he knew what this fish was expecting in the near future. Kuro, looking at the fish, understood where it would be in the next instant. That is, he anticipated its movement. Li Han realized that Kuro had simply incredible abilities from the beginning, and with a little patience and his strength, they managed to catch fish without a rod. At the right moment, Kuro would give the command, and then it was just a matter of technique. After a while, a lot of fish were floundering on dry land. It was enough to keep them from getting hungry. The third day of survival training continued. Li Han praised his companion. They had caught as many as 8 fish today. Kuro replied that he had practiced and become more experienced. The boys carried the catch into the cave. Kuro said that Jose was sure to like it, and Li Han added that he was getting better and better at cooking fish. As they got closer to the cave, the young men stopped. This came as a surprise to them, for they had assumed that their hiding place was well hidden. Li Han tossed the fish aside and, going quickly down the slope, told Kuro to wait here. He himself rushed toward the camp. From afar, it was obvious that their camp had been visited by some outsiders. Li Han realized that this was not good. Running into the cave, Li Han thought that something was definitely wrong. Li Han was covered in cold sweat from what he saw. He called out loudly for Jose. Jose was lying on the ground and didn't move. Everything around him was scattered. Del Simon grabbed the practice sword that had been thrown to him. Simon wondered, hadn't Dimitri heard there was going to be survival training? Why had he brought swords with him? 2 swords besides. Dimitri replied that he was thinking of learning to fight with swords in both hands. However, he didn't understand why Del had agreed to the duel in the first place. Del Simon said that if his interlocutor really fought with Li Han, then Dmitry Vladimirovich Petrov, the headman of Class B, was in front of him. Simon swung his sword and said that he heard that Petrov wanted to transfer to A class. He wanted to see if the decision had been rushed. Petrov thought that he definitely liked this guy. His eyes glowed unnaturally. The young men moved towards each other, swinging their wooden swords. They were definitely starting to measure their strength. Petrov, swinging, tried to strike a strong blow at his opponent. However, Simon deftly dodged the attack. Petrov asked his interlocutor, "Is this really all he is capable of?" Simon replied, "Did his opponent really think so?" Dmitri swung his sword in front of him with his arm outstretched in front of him. Simon jumped back in time, and the sword flew past him. Petrov continued to attack. He thought that if his opponent was retreating, he was better off. Each of the opponents behaved confidently and attacked boldly. However, Simon was more experienced and easily evaded his opponent's attacks. When Simon attacked again, Petrov barely managed to dodge. His sword flew over his head. Dmitri thought he had to concentrate more. Simon lunged forward again. Dmitri, expecting this attack, managed to dodge spectacularly. His opponent's sword flew past him again. Using his telepathy skills, Simon made his sword strike his opponent. Dmitri fell to the ground. Simon apologized and said that in hand-to-hand combat, Dmitri would certainly have won. But after all, they were telepaths, so the outcome of the battle was different. Simon wondered if Li Han was stronger than this Petrov or not. Li Han lifted Jose off the ground and shouted for him to wake up. There was terror in our hero's eyes. Jose opened his eyes and said that he was alive, and for Li Han to stop yelling so loudly. However, it was obvious that Jose was not feeling well. All three young men were sitting around the fire again. Li Han asked who had treated Jose like that. Jose replied that it was Karl-Heinz. He has a posse of 7 men. Jose said those men took all their food. They will come again, so they should find a more secure place. Li Han disagreed. He said that he was not a tolerant person who would let all sorts of freaks bully his friends. However, the young men came to the decision that they should find a new hiding place. Let the rivals have a chance to temporarily set up in that place. Li Han announced that at sunset they would take their opponents by surprise, and then that squad would be in trouble. As darkness fell, Li Han, spear in hand, and Kuro watched the cave from their hiding place. As expected, an enemy squad had occupied their hideout. There was even a guard posted outside. Li Han said they would start as soon as Kuro was ready. The companion agreed. Li Han said he wouldn't be able to do it alone, but together they would defeat those rascals. Kuro thought that Li Han was the only one who believed in him so far. He can't let his friend down. Kuro tossed the stones in front of him and used his superpowers to send them at the opponents with great speed. The sentries in front of the cave were attacked by the stones. They didn't realize what was happening. Carl thought it was an ambush and pumped to have everyone gather outside. He also headed for the exit. Those who ran outside saw their brethren lying on the ground and squirming in pain. Our heroes were discovered. The opponents shouted that stones were being thrown at them from those bushes. It was necessary to dodge. And as the stones continued to fly, those running up to the bushes also received their portion of cobblestones. They did not understand what to do because they were in the dark. After the preliminary artillery attack with stones, the infantry came into action. Li Han, using his spear, began to strike at the approaching opponents. Carl was surprised to see that his squad was practically deactivated. It happened so quickly that the cadets under his leadership didn't even have time to realize it. In the light that was burning in the cave, the rivals could be seen standing against each other. Li Han on one side and Karl-Heinz on the other. Carl smiled and said that Li Han was in front of him. He had been waiting for this meeting for a long time. However, does Li Han really want to say that he scattered the 6 men alone? He would never believe it. Karl-Heinz said there was bound to be someone else and asked who Li Han came with. Li Han said Kuro should come out. He'll deal with this Carl guy one-on-one. Heinz thought, did the two of them really overpower his guys? Did Kuro have a hand in it? Li Han had said they were here to avenge Jose. Carl was wrong to think he could get away with it. Carl said that Li Han had had enough of his chatter and picked up a stick from the ground. He added that this time, Li Han would be in trouble. Our hero took his spear with both hands and said that in that case Carl should attack instead of talking a lot. Carl swung and tried to deliver a staggering blow at his opponent. Li Han thrust his spear forward to block his opponent's attack. Li Han effectively dodged and counterattacked Carl. The attack was successful and Heinz was hit hard on his back. His mouth was even bleeding. Karl-Heinz definitely didn't expect the start of the fight to be so bad for him. However, he did not give up. Heinz swung again and attempted to strike his opponent. Li Han once again calmly dodged Carl's sword. Carl missed the strike again. This time the blow came to his chest. It was again very painful. Carl bent down in pain. Li Han, without releasing his weapon from his hands, asked, "Is it hard for the opponent?" Heinz could hardly stand on his feet. Li Han told him to get ready. After all, this is just the beginning. It's not a good idea to relax. Carl turned to face his opponent and told him not to show off. No one is afraid of him. The next moment, another blow came. It hit him in the face. Carl couldn't stand on his feet. Li Han stood beside his opponent with his spear in his hand. Karl-Heinz struggled to get up. Carl, bleeding, tried to crawl away. He couldn't believe that Li Han was so strong. Li Han had said that Jose wasn't even alive. Why did he have to beat him to such an extent? Carl raised his head and looked at his opponent. He thought that he dared not look down on him. Heinz took the ground in his hand and told Li Han not to dare to think that he was better. Karl-Heinz was a famous actor in Germany, a born talent. His father had reached great heights in politics due to his popularity. Carl's father's ambitions had no end in sight, though. He remembered his father saying if the son was a telepath, you could conquer this country. His father had said that love for whoever got in his son's way would pay the price. Rising from the ground to his feet, Carl told his rival that he had progressed very far in his studies. Carl added that he would not let Li Han mess things up in his career. With that, the German threw the ground in his opponent's eyes. Li Han clutched his eyes and shouted that he couldn't see anything. His eyes were hurt. At that moment, Carl tried to attack him by swinging his fist. The blow hit his jaw, and Li Han collapsed to the ground like a sack. At the same time, he dropped his spear from his hands. Kuro cried out fearfully and rushed to his friend's aid. It was done emotionally and in a fit of anger. Kuro wasn't even in control of himself. Karl-Heinz lifted Li Han by his collar and was about to deliver another fist punch. Kuro rushed to his aid with all his legs. Karl-Heinz looked menacingly at Kuro and ordered him to stand still. Kuro stopped like a stumbling block. Kuro stood there and watched as Heinz threw multiple punches at his friend. In doing so, he could do nothing. He couldn't even move. Heinz let go of his opponent and Li Han fell to the ground. He stood up to his full height and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Heinz picked up the stick in his hands and looked at Kuro standing in a daze nearby. Carl clutched the stick tighter with both hands and said that he intended to teach them a lesson. As he did so, he looked sternly into Kuro's eyes. Kuro was in great emotional excitement. His eyes lit up, and stretching his arms forward, he told Carl not to touch Li Han. Carl moved close to Kuro and asked, did he really want to get beaten up too? Karl-Heinz held a stick in one hand and grabbed Kuro's collar with his other hand. He said that he didn't like this Kuro right away. What was such a useless person even doing in the ARC? Carl added that he should have dealt with Kuro earlier. At that moment, Li Han appeared behind his back. A powerful fist punch to the jaw immediately followed. The blow was so strong that Carl, unable to stay on his feet, rolled over and fell face down on the ground. Li Han, with a furious expression on his face, clenching his fist, asked what use was Carl. He found some henchmen and hid behind their backs. Li Han said that Del, Simon, Dmitry Petrov, Jose, and Kuro, any one of them would be tougher than Karl-Heinz. Li Han swung his stick over his opponent sitting on the ground and asked if he needed a little fiddling to get ahead. Li Han looked menacingly at his opponent. Carl looked at Li Han with consternation. Li Han said that his opponent was just a lowlife. Li Han swung his stick at Carl and pretended to strike, but stopped his weapon at the last moment in front of his opponent's face. Li Han stuck his spear into the ground in front of Carl's face and said that everyone has a reason to be first. The German would have to find another way to achieve it. As he left, he said that if Carl laid a finger on his friends, he wouldn't get off that easy next time. Lying on the ground with his eyes closed, Carl thought that he never wanted to be a telepath. Carl continued to lie on the ground in the same pose, even when left alone. After a while, Karl-Heinz left the RC of his own accord. Jose greeted his returning friends with a smile. This time, Kuro helped his friend move around by supporting him by the hand. The next day, the fishing continued. The young men were getting better and better at it each time. The 3 days on the desert island flew by very quickly. The transport helicopters appeared in the sky at the appointed time. Jose said that he would not want to repeat such an experience. Li Han and Kuro were in solidarity with him. The co-workers thanked Li Han, Kuro, and Jose for leaving them food. Thanks to that food, they were able to survive. How did they manage to catch so many fish? Hasa said that Li Han had a special thanks. If he hadn't stopped Carl, all of them would have had a hard time. Li Han received a message that the training session was over. The cadets had performed well during this week. Del, Simon, and Dmitry Petrov also received a message from Sergeant Red. Petrov didn't think he would be happy to hear that voice. However, he was terribly hungry. Li Han was told that they should climb aboard the helicopter in the order they would be called. The guy thought that they would be divided. Waiting for the cadets in the helicopter was Sergeant John Red. He took a closer look at each of the men present. The sergeant said that the instructors had been monitoring this training the entire time, thanks to the drones and cameras that had been installed. It was unanimously decided to keep all 4 of them. Red added that this was not just a survival training, but a test to find the savior of mankind. Sergeant Red officially and loudly called out the names of the cadets, Kuro, Simon, and Dmitry. The sergeant paused and called out the name Li Han. He said that all 4 of them were moving to the second course. Jose appeared in front of our hero's eyes. The young man said that it had been a long time since they had a day off. Jose suggested that they go to play ball. Li Han was surprised. Does Jose really suggest playing soccer? Jose pointed to the soccer ball and asked if Li Han knew how to handle it. Li Han nodded affirmatively. Today was just the rare day in arcade when the boys, split into two teams, played soccer. Jose said that if everyone was in, then they could start. Kuro immediately wanted to sit down. Petrov asked Simon if he was using his powers. Del replied that not during the match. Only on special occasions are students allowed to rest. Today's occasion was a meeting of the instructors. Lee Han and Petrov were trying to take the ball away from each other. At the instructors' meeting, they discussed the cadets' transition to the second year. All those involved were present. Also spotted among those present were John Red and Wei Chung. The boss, ARC Chief of Staff Alexander Lacour, said that they were getting started. The head of Treatment Corps No. 2, Sasha Grace, said there are 4 this time. She'd like to hear about them. After hearing about Del, Simon, and Dmitry Petrov, the Chief of Staff said they could be transferred without a problem. They had more than enough strength. As for the remaining ones, Lee Han from the beginning, his ability level was the lowest and still remains so. It was only thanks to Sergeant Red that the boy didn't stay in Class D. The Chief of Staff asked why they had to send him to the next class. Wei Chung said that Sergeant Red had already said that Lee Han not only had good hand-to-hand combat skills, but also patience and willpower. All of these qualities are necessary for a fighter. The Chief of Staff remarked that Wei Chung rarely praises someone like this. Sergeant Red thought that if Chung didn't, he wouldn't be able to transfer to the second year. In addition to his great potential in telekinesis, his ability to control a situation is remarkable. Recalling his fight with the cadet, Red thought that at that moment, Lee Han had added telekinesis to his rotational power. The most amazing thing was that he did it all by himself. On the soccer field, Lee Han beat his opponent Simon with the ball and passed on. The instructor added that no one had taught the cadet how to do this. Lee Han took a powerful shot at the goal. The Chief of Staff suggested moving on to discuss the next cadet. Jose praised his colleague and said that Lee Han is sly. He said that he did not know how to do it, but he himself performed beautiful kicks on the ball. Lee Han replied that it was an accident. Petrov asked Simon, "Doesn't everyone in England play soccer well?" Simon wondered. What does that have to do with him? Sasha Grace, hearing the name of the next candidate, was surprised. Are her colleagues really mocking her? After all, Kuro is mentally the weakest. She took it upon herself to explain. Immediately after promotion, their bodies are modified. And the most important thing in this process is mental stamina. Grace looked at the instructors and asked, "Do they really want to destroy this boy?" Sergeant John Red said that Kuro's telekinesis is at the highest level and more powerful than many famous talents. He can also see into the not-too-distant future, which is an exceptional ability. The Chief of Staff said that in this case, the issue is not strength but endurance. Sergeant Red said that this is why they should be transferred together. Lee Han has a great influence on Kuro's willpower by playing the role of an older brother. Alexander Lacour thought, what a person this Lee Han is. The Chief of Staff added that they seem to really want him to transfer to the second year. The question referred to the instructors. Wei Cheng and John Red looked at their chief carefully in response. The boys on the field continued to play soccer excitedly, unaware that their fate was being decided right now. Jose received the ball and shouted that it was a great pass. He continued toward the opponent's goal with the ball. Jose passed around 2 defenders, and as he moved forward with the ball, he yelled that they could try to take the ball away from him. The goalkeeper was alert and prepared to deflect the opponent's shot. Jose saw Simon and Petrov in front of him and thought he was surrounded. A colleague caught up with Lee Han, and as he drew up, Jose passed him the ball. Lee Han, without stopping, sent the ball into the opponent's goal in 1 touch. He shouted with joy that it was a goal. Simon and Petrov silently looked at each other. Lee Han and Jose shook hands. It was a great teamwork and a well-played combination. Someone said menacingly that enough games had been played. Lee Han and Jose looked back at the voice. Standing in front of the young men was Sergeant Red. He said that the meeting was over. The results would be announced soon. But if everyone is here, he could tell. The sergeant said that they had received approval for the transfer. Lee Han silently clenched his fists, continued to look at the sergeant. Jose approached our hero and asked what was wrong with him. Why is he so stiff? Jose added that he congratulated him. Smiling, he added that Lee Han's hour had come. Lee Han smiled back. Lee Han extended his hand to Jose and said that they would see each other again, and he thanked him for a great game of soccer. Sergeant Red menacingly ordered everyone to disperse to their rooms. The instructor added that the 4 of them should pack up and get ready. Lee Han looked straight into his instructor's eyes and thanked the sergeant aloud. Lee Han thanked the sergeant for the transfer from D class and for today's transfer. It was all thanks to Sergeant Red. John Red, pulling out a cigar, said he wasn't sure if he had any credit for this. but Cadet Li Han should know that there is no turning back. If he completes his second year without incident, then they will see each other again. In admonishing the cadet, the instructor told him to be sure to survive. Li Han saluted his commanding officer. All four of them packed their belongings and were ready to relocate. Li Han asked, should they go to the second treatment building now? Kuro looked at his friend again with tears in his eyes. Li Han said not to worry because they were together. Kuro, remembering what they do to students' bodies in the second year, said he was very scared. After all, they will perform surgery on them to speed up the development of the body. Petrov, laughing and stretching his hand up, said that fear is great because they will become even stronger. Simon wondered what the jerk was rejoicing about. In Treatment Building 2, Sasha Grace told the boys to go to the lab. Now, for 5 weeks, she would monitor them. The scientist introduced herself. Sasha Grace added that it is the 5 weeks that their bodies will develop. 2 of those weeks would be spent in the incubator and the next 3 in rehabilitation. The cadets looked at the capsule and thought, do 14 days really need to be spent in this thing? Li Han waved his hand to his colleagues and said that they would see each other in a few weeks. The co-workers nodded silently to Li Han. Apparently, words were inappropriate here. Grace, watching the cadets, thought, this is what this prime candidate of theirs looks like. Grace watched as the guys said goodbye to each other. Even now, it was clear that they all had different personalities. The cadets needed to be injected with a nutrient solution the week before. Grace and her assistant were doing the routine. Kuro and Li Han, with oxygen masks on their faces, were waist-deep in the liquid. There was fear in Kuro's eyes, as always. Dmitry Petrov was already completely submerged at this point and was not feeling well. Li Han, while submerged in the liquid, also noticed that he was having trouble breathing. Grace knew that this was claustrophobia and that every future soldier should go through this. She knew she had to be patient for a while. Soon they would fall asleep. Grace told her colleague that when the sleep immersion process was complete, they would begin surgery. A week went by and there were no problems. However, someone may have a hard time tolerating surgery. If this continued, could the human race continue to exist? The cadets continued to be in capsules filled with liquid. Grace held her head. The assistant asked that the doctor must be very tired and suggested resting. She would monitor the progress of the experiment herself. In the restroom, Grace saw Sergeant Red. The girl asked, if the instructor didn't care about these children, why did he keep coming to this building? The sergeant, taking a drag on his cigar, looked at the girl from under his brow. John Red said that it would be very sad if such valuable personnel died through her fault. Sasha Grace assured her interlocutor that everything would be fine. The second phase of the nutrient solution is now underway. During the second phase, the dragon's telekinesis power is created. In other words, a high-density liquid mixed with the dragon's heart is injected. The sergeant thought if one could make the dragon heart resonate, it would be easier to control the telekinesis ability. It would also be possible to give Li Han a little push. Sasha Grace received emergency information on her gadget. The girl's facial expression changed dramatically. Grace rushed towards the lab and shouted that something had happened there. The sergeant followed her. In the capsule that Li Han was in, something had gone wrong. The guy started to come to his senses. Grace yelled that it was a sudden awakening and he might be in too much pain. Dr. Grace shouted that she needed to stop the process immediately. She had already even reached for the emergency abort button. Sergeant Red grabbed the girl's arm. Grace was indignant. What was the sergeant doing? John Red looked at the doctor intently from top to bottom and said that you can't abort the operation. This guy is obligated to move on to the second year. In her office, Sasha Grace asked her interlocutor if he was doing well. A grown-up Li Han replied that he was doing well thanks to the doctor. Li Han smiled cheerfully. The doctor said that this had never happened before in her practice. It was the first time they had seen a telepath reject the introduction of a dragon's heart. Grace cried out, "Are they crazy? After all, the guy will die if they don't stop the process. It is necessary to stop injecting the solution." Li Han was not the cadet who had gotten here through the gift of telekinesis. There was genuine fear in the doctor's eyes. The sergeant looked into the doctor's eyes and told them to skip the mental induction process and continued, "This cadet will survive anyway." The doctor told Li Han that he would be registered as a case of physical enhancement only and asked if he was all right. "Is there any organic rejection?" Li Han replied that he felt fine, he had no problems. Now, at least because of the price, he won't be expelled. The doctor thought that this cadet's mental stability was amazing. Isn't this the soldier that Sergeant Red was promoting? Stamina and telepathy are directly related to each other. So why is his psychic ability weak and his fortitude great? The doctor said the young man was free to leave. Surely it had something to do with rejection. Petrov happily greeted his colleague and told Li Han that they had finally moved on to the second year. Li Han agreed and said that the 5 weeks had flown by very quickly. He was in good spirits. Li Han looked at his coworkers and said that they had changed a lot, especially Kuro. Kuro had indeed changed in size the most. Li Han evaluated everyone from head to toe and said that it was good that everyone was unharmed. Del Simon indifferently asked, "What's there to be happy about? After all, this is normal," and said for Li Han not to be conceited, even though he's special. The sophomore dorm was no different from the freshman dorm, but since sophomore year, everything was done in squads. Each squad is made up of 4 to 10 people. At this moment, there were 12 sophomores in the ARC. Li Han couldn't believe it. Would he really have his own room now? With him in the squad would be Kuro and 7 other guys. The young men were greeted by the cadets. One of them said he was Kato Svoki, the squad leader. Kato explained that although there were many disciplines in the second year, the 3 main ones to focus on were firearms, training, aerial combat, and battle simulation. Kato suggested that there was no point in talking about the first one. Modern weapons are quite effective when fighting monsters. The squad leader said that among the known monsters, there are those with low intelligence, ogre, Grant, and werewolf. But their commander named Ella has a well-developed intelligence. She uses telekinesis on par with the fighters. Li Han asked, if she uses it, will the weapons be useless? Kato replied that firearms would be useless against telekinesis. However, Ella can't use telekinesis indefinitely like a dragon. There won't be much left of her when the power runs out. Kato Swoki said that firearms training is important, but aerial combat and simulated combat are more important because squads compete with each other. Battle simulation is a training exercise conducted in an artificially created arena in the ARC. The main goal is to capture the flag that is on the enemy base. Here, everything is decided by strategy and individual skills. However, this training is very dangerous. Even without the use of metal weapons, there is a possibility of death. Everything here is extremely tough. Air combat takes place on airboards. Here it is quite easy to bypass the enemy. In the rear, there should always be supporters. They control most of the boards, either helping to move them or in emergencies to strike the enemy. Kato said that until recently, they didn't have strong telepaths in their squad. But now that Kuro had come, they had nothing to fear. Kato, looking into the newcomer's eyes, asked, "He can handle it, right?" Kuro, unable to bear the look, lowered his eyes and said he would try. Kato's co-worker sternly said, "His opinion doesn't interest anyone. If the team needs his skills, he won't be turned away." Li Han said that of course Kuro would do well. Just don't scold him all the time. He has a vulnerable soul. The sophomore leaned over Li Han and shouted, "What's he talking about?" No one asked his opinion. Kato calmed him down. He said that Li Han was right about something. These cadets were here for the first day and didn't know much yet. But there's more to come. Kato turned to Li Han. Even though they're all in the same class together, the others have more experience, so he should keep his voice down. Kato Swoki gave him a sneaky look and said that Li Han was only here because he needed Kuro. And he got these two as if they were 2 in 1, always together. Kato added that Li Han had the lowest level of telekinesis, so no one expected much from him. It would be better if he didn't mess around. Li Han smiled and told Commander Kato that he understood. He extended his hand forward and said that he would do his best to stay out of the squad's sight. Kato, in honor of the acquaintance, shook our hero's hand. Kato wondered if this petty cadet would be enough. Li Han thought he would last as long as it was needed. The next day at the firing range were firing. The new arrivals were in full uniform and had ammunition. Li Han hit the targets and showed good results. He was satisfied with everything so far. Li Han thought that things were not bad in this squad. Kato and the squad were morally supportive. Kato Swaki called out to Kuro and asked why he was taking so long to dig in. Kuro, with a machine gun in his hand, was confused and said he would hurry up. Kato was ashamed of Kuro's new cadet and said it was a real shame. Li Han was behind the performance of the main squad after all, and thought that he still had a long way to go before recognition. After firearms training, Li Han showered and changed his clothes to go to the general group meeting. Kato said that Li Han would be the backup. During the simulated battle, the team must consist of a minimum number of fighters, and this squad has enough hand-to-hand combat masters without Li Han. Kato added that the entire sophomore class will be watching the competition at the training ground. Li Han might watch as well, so there's no need to be upset. Li Han had a communication session with his brothers again. They were consistently fine. In the gym at practice today, there was a capture the flag. The 3rd and 9th squads are participating. Kato Svoki told a colleague that there are newcomers in the 3rd squad. We have to be careful and watch out for telekinesis. Li Han thought, If there are rookies among them, it's Del Simon. The opponents also recognized this guy. Everyone concerned was wary. Now there was a Del Simon in the third squad. Del Simon is that genius telekineticist. What bad luck for whoever's going to fight against him. Del Simon has been front and center on the screens. Everyone was interested in watching this cadet. The opponents were surprised. Does the third squad really want to attack them directly head-on? That's not serious. The leader of the third squad said that they now had a telekinesis genius on their team. They are willing to rethink their battle tactics. Simon stood with his hands up. A cloud of internal energy formed around him, and the cadet was ready to use his telekinesis skills. The opponent said it was ridiculous. They had had enough of telekinesis. They should just attack using physical force. The next moment, the opponents were surprised. Their weapons were gone from their hands. What should they do next? Del Simon did not rest at this point. He continued to use his telekinesis abilities. The guy stretched his hand forward, his eyes glowing unnaturally. The opponents looked up and saw their swords hovering right above them. This was only possible because of the rookie Simon's skills. Taking advantage of the fact that the opponents were disarmed, the third squad attacked them using their swords. The leader of the squad, holding the opponent's flag, proclaimed victory and said that they didn't even have to work hard for this. Kato Swoki told the newcomer Kuro that the role of telepaths in such battles is overkill. They have a similar pattern. If Kuro uses his abilities, they will be able to win. Lee Han told the squad leader that he didn't think so. Lee Han added that the 9th squad doesn't take the terrain into account and doesn't think about tactics. Therefore, only the strength and skills of the fighters should be relied on. Kato Swoki angrily said that Lee Han is not the squad leader and no one is interested in his opinion. Lee Han thought that now he understood the reason why Kato Swoki hated him. The assistant squad leader asked Lee Han to step aside. The cadet told our hero that he's an outstanding fighter, even the commander recognizes that. However, he doesn't belong in this squad. Everyone thinks so. Lee Han thought it was as expected. Kato Swoki is trying to keep him in line. Out loud, he asked why he didn't fit in. The interlocutor replied that it's because Lee Han isn't afraid to cross Kato during training. By the way, he sometimes feels that Lee Han would act better in his place. However, only one person can be the head of the squad. If Lee Han pushed a little more, the squad leader might get angry, and then there would be a split in the squad. The guy said that since Kato was the squad leader, Lee Han couldn't cross him. When there's a period of redistribution between the squads, it would be better if Lee Han transferred to another squad. Lee Han thought that it would indeed be the right decision. He realized that the leader had to gain the trust of all the squad members, and he had encroached on his authority. Lee Han decided to write an application for transfer to another squad. The corresponding application landed on the desk of instructor Wei Chung. Chung was surprised and asked if Lee Han was sure about it. Lee Han confirmed and added that he had thought hard about it. Wei Chung said that the review process will take some time. The instructors need to discuss this matter in the meeting. Already in his room, Lee Han thought that it was good that the application was not accepted immediately, but would still be discussed. Now he can focus on personal training rather than team training if he is now free. While he waits for the decision, he needs to learn about each squad and decide what to do next. Kuro was just visiting our hero. He asked what Lee Han was talking about with the deputy head of the squad. Lee Han said it wasn't important and asked how the air training was going. After all, it's already tomorrow. Kuro said that he could fly 4 airboards at the same time. Not the empty boards, but the moment the cadets are on them. Lee Han got excited. He said that he knew Kuro's skills would grow quickly here, and that Kuro was now one of the strongest sophomores. Lee Han said not to be afraid of Kuro. He would always cheer for him. Many cadets were now discussing the fact that there was a very cool newcomer in the 7th squad. His name is Kuro. Everyone was curious to see what Kuro could do. Lee Han was also among the audience. At that moment, Kuro was being broadcast on the big screen. Lee Han thought that his friend would definitely do well. The opponents were ready to fight the 7th squad. Kato Swoki told Kuro to be sure to take care of them. It was announced that squad number 1 was fighting against squad number 7. The type of training is aerial combat. The purpose of the battle is to learn how to use the airborgs. Dragons fight mostly in the air. Almost all of them can fly. Currently, the main equipment is the airboard. This is an electronic airborne board that is a hybrid of a snowboard and a robotic drone. Some are specially modified into a combat version and have firearms. In aerial combat, one person can operate 2 airboards. That is, he uses one board for support and movement, and the other for dealing damage to the enemy. There is a support position on the team. This is the most important fighter in this training. He works only with the other team members' arrow boards and takes control of as many pieces as his strength allows. The Sapworth makes life noticeably easier for his teammates by controlling the techniques with telekinesis. Lee Han thought that this position was perfect for Kuro. He's able to control 4 boards at the same time. Kato Swoki said that the 7th squad is performing. If they stick to the plan, victory will be theirs. Kato commanded the vanguard to come forward. The deputy commander led his cadets forward. The commander of the 1st squad also ordered his cadets to move like this and made the first attack. The warrior thought that the opponents would advance cautiously, just as Kato had said. Next, they would separate in different directions. The attacker from the 7th squad moved closer to one of the opponents and swung his sword, preparing to deliver a striking blow. His opponent lost his balance after this blow and fell down the board. So far, everything was going according to plan. Lee Han was watching this battle closely. Already, 2 cadets from Squad 1 had already dropped out of the battle. The 7th squad is really strong. It was as if they knew ahead of time where the enemy was moving. Our hero realized that it was Kuro's merit. After the game, after the debriefing, the commander said that Kuro had a major role in the battle. The 1st squad has a strong support. Each fighter will control his own airboard. If Kuro can take control of 4 boards at once, then he should take the commander's board and his deputy's board. Kato told Kuro to use his ability to see the future to learn about the enemy's movements. The deputy told the boss that they are both good at close combat. We need to focus on that and scatter the guys in the 1st squad as they want. Lee Han thought that the commander's plan had a good chance of success, at least in theory. Kato Swoki and his deputy, as always, made the decision to work cohesively and observe team spirit. Kuro was tense. He realized that he couldn't make a single mistake. If he made a mistake, the team would lose and it would be his fault. There were only 2 people left in the 1st squad. Were the opponents always so strong? Against the 2 cadets from Squad 1, 4 cadets from Squad 7 were hovering on the boards in the arena. Kuro had their backs to them. The leader of the 1st squad realized that they had to deal with the opponent's support. Only then could they hope to succeed. The leader of the 1st squad told his colleague that they would now proceed with Plan A. Kato Swoki wondered, would the opponents just go for a frontal attack like that? One of the attackers did go on the attack and attack Kato and his deputy at once. Kato thought that this guy was caught. However, the opponent grabbed both opponents tightly and wouldn't let go, thus deactivating them. The 1st squad commander bypassed the 2 remaining opponents and headed further towards the supporter. The warrior from the 7th squad did not immediately realize where his opponent was going and decided to leave him alone. At this time, he was called out by Kato and told that they needed help. They can't get free. Does the opponent really want to throw them off the boards? Lee Han thought that the commander shouldn't help right now. A free player should protect the support. If Kuro was cut off from the rest of the team, it would be considered a loss. Before the battle, the commander told Kuro that the 4th and 8th egg boards should always be by his side. The cadet from the 1st squad was already in close proximity to Kuro. Neither Kuro nor Kato had expected this. Help to the commander came in time and the opponent was thrown off his board. Kato and his deputy were free. However, when they turned around, they saw Kuro defeated and lying on the floor. A cadet from the 1st squad is standing next to him. Kato and his deputy, having lost control, fell off the boards. It was a natural consequence of their support passing out. The onlookers didn't understand what was happening. After all, wasn't this a one-on-one battle now? Kuro had controlled 2 airboards, but now he was completely exhausted. Lee Han assumed that this was how it would end. Kato had relied entirely on Kuro's telekinesis, and the entire plan was built around that. Kuro jumped to his feet and tried to use his abilities against the opponent standing next to him. Nearby, the 2 opponents had broken arrow boards burning. Kuro was tense and frightened. There was nothing he could do now. The opponent smirked and said that it was a great pity. Lee Han thought that Kuro was under tremendous pressure and ended up making a mistake. As a result of this battle, the 1st squad won. It was quite unexpected for everyone. Lee Han had not allowed this outcome to happen. Lee Han thought that if Kato had accepted him into the team, Kuro wouldn't have been left alone. Our hero thought it would be different if he was the squad leader. 3 weeks passed. Lee Han was once again in Instructor Wei Chung's office. It was regarding questions about Lee Han's application. The instructor said that the application was reviewed and approved. Lee Han's application was for the position of the head of the new squad. Lee Han was pleasantly surprised. Did the leadership really agree? Wei Chang said that in his first year, Lee Han had shown himself to be a true commander, and the instructors had unanimously decided to give him a chance. It would be a test of his reputation and charisma. Lee Han familiarized himself with the conditions for forming a new squad. The squad must have at least 4 members, including the head of the squad. From other squads, it is allowed to take 1 person from each squad. The one chosen has the right to refuse to join the new squad. Lee Han thought that if he followed these points, he would become an enemy to the heads of all the squads as soon as he started to act. We have to prepare well so that we don't miss out on the most talented guys. Lee Han replied to the instructor that if he says it will work out, then it will. Wei Chung smiled and said that Lee Han can grasp everything on the fly. Therefore, he expects good results. Now Lee Han should focus on selecting candidates for his team. The first 2 that came to our hero's mind were these 2, Jose and Kuro. They were cadets who had been vetted by him personally, and Lee Han was willing to vouch for them. Lee Han knew that Jose wasn't here, so he decided to talk to Kuro first. Lee Han remembered that there was another candidate. Our hero knocked on his door. Petrov asked what was wrong with Lee Han. Kato was not happy. He thought that with Kuro they were losing all the time. The deputy said they should have taken Simon. Simon showed himself in all his glory. Kato recognized that this guy had taken down several opponents single-handedly. His hand-to-hand combat and telekinesis skills are impeccable. Kuro is useless under the same conditions. His abilities are bullshit. Kato said that if they don't find a replacement for him, they'll have to permanently put him in as a supporter. Lee Han, standing around the corner, heard this conversation. Petrov, hearing the suggestion of a new squad, asked who else Lee Han was going to call up. Lee Han replied that Kuro was first and foremost. He wants them together from the beginning. Petrov suggested that no commander would agree to give up his fighter. Lee Han looked his interlocutor in the eye and said that he never responded to his offer. Petrov thanked him but said that leaving would be a betrayal, and he couldn't let his squad down. Dmitri added that he is the head in the 5th squad. He can't abandon his guys. Lee Han, understanding, nodded and said that he assumed that answer. Petrov said he had more to add. However, this is his personal opinion. It would be better for them to remain rivals and not play boss and subordinate. Lee Han, smiling, told Petrov not to cry when they meet on the battlefield. Petrov replied that next time he would break both of his opponent's arms. Members of the other squads, as our hero expected, began to treat him with hostility. When they met, they asked, did he really decide to lead his own squad? He must have wanted power. The news that Lee Han was forming his own squad quickly spread among the sophomores. It wasn't surprising that the heads of the class were following him. Kato Swoki was especially partial to the idea. He told our hero that it was like stabbing him in the back. At the next meeting of the squad, Kato Swoki told Lee Han to form his own squad and leave quickly. However, they would not give Kuro to him. Kuro was confused and tried not to make eye contact with anyone. He didn't want to be the cause of the fight. Lee Han told his opponent that Kuro would not be able to unleash his talent under him. Kato asked, did Lee Han really think he was the smartest? In time, Kuro will become one of the best fighters in the squad. Lee Han asked if Kato was really going to when the war starts. Lee Han added that Kuro will develop much faster with him. The squad leader's job is to win even with limited forces. Nothing will change if you blame someone else for the defeat. Kato Swoki was already furious. He grabbed Lee Han's chest and told him to shut up immediately. He wouldn't get Kuro anyway. Lee Han, unafraid, said that this matter can't be decided by Kato. Kuro has to make his own choice. Kato Swoki turned to Kuro and said that if he wants to leave, then he will be destroyed. Lee Han said that Kato Swoki can only talk. Even if he drowns, he will still continue to talk. Kato Swoki swung his fist in rage and hit Lee Han's jaw with all his might. Lee Han wiped the dirt off his cheek and said that he didn't even want to rub his hands on that man. Lee Han told his friend Kuro that he would wait for him. The cadets in this squad thought that Lee Han had lost his mind. Who would ever leave their squad for another squad that didn't exist yet? Lee Han thought that if he didn't reassemble the squad, he would pay dearly for it. Heading to his room, Lee Han thought that he had already talked to everyone he planned to talk to. Lee Han was confused. He didn't understand what he should do now. If this continued, he would be alone. While thinking, Lee Han didn't look where he was going and ran into a stranger. It was a man wearing a hood and a skull mask. It was impossible to see his face. Lee Han apologized and explained that he was thinking. The stranger followed without stopping. Lee Han was surprised at the speed at which he moved. Lee Han looked back at the masked man and wondered if he could dress like that here. At that moment, the gadget on our hero's hand beeped out an incoming message. There was a message saying that the heads of all the squads were ordered to assemble in front of the number 2 treatment building. Sasha Grace said at the formation that these 6 newcomers should be distributed among the squads. This time, the new head would be the first to be chosen. The doctor announced for Li Han to step forward and step out of the formation. Li Han thought that this was his chance. He should get at least one newcomer. Our hero introduced himself and said that he was the head of Squad 13 and he was short of men. He would be happy to have each of the new recruits. Kato Svoki laughed. What do you mean not enough? He doesn't have anyone in his squad at all. The cadets nearby also laughed. One of the recruits immediately raised his hand and said that he wanted to join. Li Han was very excited, for it was Jose. In the evening in the room, Jose said that it would be great if at least one more person joined their squad. Li Han noticed that some of the newcomers were still undecided. Li Han thanked Jose for his trust and for Jose joining him. He always wanted to be on a team with Jose. Jose said that those who refuse to go to Li Han's team will regret it. They just don't know what the commander is capable of. Otherwise, they would have already been in line. Li Han told his friend that from tomorrow they start working hard. Jose stretched and said he had to go to his room. Just then the door to the room opened. Standing on the threshold was Kuro. Kuro's face was bruised and bruised. There was a band-aid in some places. Li Han asked apprehensively, "What happened?" Kuro smiled slightly in response. Kuro recalled that Kato had warned him of the consequences if he decided to leave his group. Kato said that Kuro couldn't just leave them. Li Han couldn't believe his eyes. Was this really the Kuro he knew? Kuro replied that he wasn't sure. Jose happily said that the desert island team is back together. They can handle everyone now, isn't that right? Another man entered the room. He said that it was fun and asked if he could join them. The man said that everyone is now calling Li Han a traitor. Does he know that? He added that he thought the 13th squad would be the most interesting. Jose asked if this guy is familiar with Li Han. He was in the B class his freshman year. Li Han replied that their squad needed that kind of talent. The fourth member was Knut Meyer, quite a well-known personality. Meyer asked if he could join their squad. After all, didn't he come right? Li Han said that they were at odds with other squads right now, and if something went wrong, they could be disbanded. The commander asked, "Does everyone know what will follow?" Knut Meyer said it's fine. Kuro said he was in favor of it. Li Han thought he has a big responsibility now. He mustn't let the guys down. However, Li Han was absolutely sure that they would all make it together. The commander dismissed everyone and said that he would meet with the 13th squad tomorrow. In the morning at formation, the instructor welcomed everyone and said that he was happy to see Squad 13. The instructor introduced himself and said he would be escorting the sophomore class. His name is Grossman. Grossman looked at squad leader Li Han and said a personalized hello. Grossman also said hello to privates Jose Batiste and Knut Meyer. The instructor, looking at Kuro, asked what was wrong with the guy's face. Kuro, smiling, replied that he had fallen down the stairs. Grossman said that these guys were given extra time because the squad was formed later than the others. So starting today, they will have a preparatory period. They have 3 weeks at their disposal. The instructor added that after that, the squad will participate in competitions on an equal footing with the rest of the squad, so they need to be well prepared. The competitions themselves and the opponents would be chosen randomly. Li Han thought that Grossman was underestimating them. The competition, the survival path. The opponent is Squad 9. The 9th squad is made up of strong shooters and has the highest number of victories in the path of survival. Knut Meyer said he doesn't like it. It's not his at all. If he doesn't get in, he's willing to just go to the bench. Li Han slapped the cadet. He asked if Meyer had really decided to die. Li Han grabbed Meyer by his helmet and told him not to think of giving up under any circumstances. Knut said he understood. Li Han decided that he would not let any of his guys die. He told the squad that they were working on a mobile bunker plan and added that it was a name he had just made up himself. All 3 of them thought with amazement, where do such word combinations come from in their heads? The countdown was on. Squad number 9 versus Squad number 13, the path of survival. Squad 9's commander told his unit that he intended to finish off the opponents very quickly this time. Li Han, to support his unit, said that victory would be theirs. The spectators near the monitors were watching intently. This was something that no one wanted to miss. Everyone was shouting for the 9th unit to destroy the traitors. Petrov looked at the screen and realized that the 13th squad has increased popularity. Everyone is paying attention to them. Simon thought that there were no winners in this battle. He wondered how would Li Han do this time. The 13th squad ducked down and went on the offensive. They couldn't see any opponents in front of them yet. They were probably still in the initial position. Meyer hid behind a tree. He thought that the opponents were much faster than he thought. The opponents began to disperse in different directions. Meyer relayed a message to his companions that he could see the enemy, 200 meters between them. On the battlefield, an interesting picture emerged. The 9th squad moved forward, acting in a single line. 13th squad released forward scout Meyer. The rest positioned themselves behind. Li Han, reading the message from the front line, thought that the enemy was already near. Jose, frustrated, said that the enemy were acting fast, not even giving them a break. Kuro, as usual, said nothing. He rather sat in anticipation. There was a log lying in the path of the enemies. Li Han thought that at least they had time to prepare, but there still wasn't enough time to regroup. Li Han thought that if he were Knut, he would have realized the situation by now. Li Han considered various options. Knut was spotted by the enemy and was forced to retreat. As he retreated, he began to shoot back. The 9th squad managed to take cover from the hitting fire of the opponents. They hid behind trees. The commander said someone had to take out this gunner. While retreating, Knut received a small wound in his leg. However, he managed to hide behind a tree. Meyer thought that if everything went according to plan, he would join his squad. The leg injury was just a minor hindrance. Gotta buy some time. The opponents only saw one Meyer. But why is he alone? If there are only 4 opponents, was there any point in sending a scout? In any case, this fight will end in a firefight. One of the cadets told me to cover him. He's going forward. The 3 cadets from the 13th stood in the forest clearing. As they did so, they remained calm and waited for information from Meyer. Li Han told his men to get ready. It was time to move out. The whip had helped them buy enough time. Someone among the cadets suggested that perhaps Knut was injured and needed help. Li Han suggested that the 9th squad decided to wait instead of uniting and acting. Jose said that thanks to the commander, they have had time to build up their strength. The group is stronger than ever, and this is just before the battle. Kuro added that they managed to take down the tree with fire and telekinesis. The tree was subdued by the coordinated teamwork of the cadets. Fire and telekinesis had done their job. Li Han said it was time to show what they could do and called the 13th squad into battle. The cadets watching the battle from the hall thought, "What is Squad 13 doing? Why did they cut down the tree? Is it really being covered up?" Petrov and Simon immediately realized that it was done for Kuro. Meyer couldn't stand it and started shooting at his opponents from behind the tree, saying that he wouldn't surrender alive. After a while, however, Meyer realized that his machine gun needed a reload. Suddenly, an opponent appeared in front of Meyer with a machine gun in his hand. He asked in surprise, "Is Meyer really alone?" He had thought that the 13th squad was trapping them, and they were just improvising on the fly. Petrov thought that one of the 13th squad had dropped out. He'd held out for a long time. Now all they have is this shield made of wood. Would they be able to win? Simon said that there's a weakness in their tactics, but Li Han knows that. The opponent saw a log approaching them with great speed. It was impossible to stop it with shots. Squad 9's commander thought that everyone was good at shooting, but there were no people among them with telekinesis of such strength to respond. Simon thought that Li Han should calculate everything correctly and consider his weaknesses. The commander of Squad 9 shouted for everyone to immediately hide and cover. They came under a barrage of fire. The cadet shouted for his companions to stall. The opponents would soon run out of steam. Li Han mentally agreed with his opponent. He was aware of his weaknesses. However, the wooden shield would help buy time once more. The time needed for Jose to use his firepower, and then Squad 9 would be out of luck. The 9th squad was frightened and surprised. Where did the flames come from? The smoke made them unable to breathe. Those watching from the hall couldn't believe it. Could this cadet really control the fire? Now the 9th squad is suffocating from the smoke. Was it really possible? Jose tells the commander that there's enough smoke. He thinks the opponents can't see anything anymore. Li Han says for Jose to take care of those who managed to get out. Jose went to the firing line and opened aimed fire on the opponents who were getting out of the smoke-affected area while sneezing and coughing. The commander said that 2 of their squad were already out, although the enemy couldn't see anything now either. However, it wasn't like that at all. Li Han, using Kuro's abilities, had seen everything. The screen showed that the 9th squad had been eliminated and the 13th squad had won. The audience chanted. Turns out Kuro was using rocks as radar to navigate through space. That Li Han is a great shot. Petrov in the audience rejoiced that Squad 13 had won. Simon was once again convinced that Li Han and Kuro worked great as a pair. There was no limit to the joy of our heroes. Jose and Kuro were simply glowing. They were pleased with themselves. Grossman, watching from the sidelines, looked at the screen and made certain conclusions for himself. Li Han should be watched closely. This was the first time Instructor Grossman had seen such tactics displayed in this exercise. There was much to ponder here. The entire 13th squad was celebrating their victory. It was worth it. You have to experience it all to know what it feels like. Jose asked for a moment of attention and said that they would now like to hear a few words from the commander. The floor goes to Li Han, the man who led them to victory. Li Han thanked his comrades in arms. He knows that he had very aggressive tactics. They were also able to win because they acted cohesively. That was the key to success. Kuro said that his friend's plan was not aggressive, but incredibly cool. They couldn't help but succeed. Li Han noted that they were lucky. If the opponents had such physical strength, their tactics were obvious. It was clear who in the 9th squad would take what position. Meyer said it was amazing. How could Li Han read the opponent? He definitely made the right choice with the squad. Suddenly, Knut grabbed his chest and started coughing. Jose said that his colleague needed to rest for a while. Knut said it was fine. He wouldn't have missed such a feast even before his death. Grossman watched the replay of the tape and marveled. These guys had defeated the 9th squad, one of the strongest. It was necessary to crush them before Li Han and the others thought too much of themselves. The instructor was choosing who would be best suited for this purpose. He settled on the 7th squad. Grossman thought that the 7th squad would definitely do anything to make sure that there would be nothing left of the 13th squad. But what would happen if the 7th squad lost? Grossman decided to do everything he could to make sure that wouldn't happen. At this time of night, Li Han still couldn't sleep. The guy used to have insomnia because of the fear of being expelled from the ARC, but now he has the best partners, so he has nothing to fear. It didn't matter who their opponents were. Li Han believed that they would still win. Squad number 1 versus squad number 13. Battle of the captains. The captain of squad 1 naturally expected to win. He asked his colleagues if everyone remembered their plan. The captain reminded them that they should keep an eye on Jose and Kuro first. Among the sophomores, their abilities were among the strongest. The cadets of the first squad smugly decided that they would deal with their opponents without any problems. Their telekinesis might be strong, but a good beating would make them forget about it. The commander said he didn't know what the other fighters' abilities were, but they shouldn't have a problem with these ones. Fatty thought that their captain was the most powerful anyway. He's not going to lose. Petrov thought that the 13th squad hates instructors right now. Right after practicing with firearms against the 9th squad, they have to go to the captain's battle with the 1st squad. In the battle, the team captain, a fighter with a headband, must be defeated. This time in the 1st squad, the bandage went to a fat man. However, this monster from the 1st squad, even 2 or 3 people are unlikely to put down. This particular fatty was chosen to be the captain, so now the squad can hold off long-range attacks and destroy the enemy. The tactic of the 1st squad is called charging tank. Petrov wondered what Li Han would do this time. Simon asked his interlocutor to be quiet. However, the cadets from the 1st squad wondered why Kuro had a headband on his head this time. The fatty from squad 1 wondered what they would do now. He didn't see Li Han either. Li Han told Kuro not to be scared. Kuro, with a scared face, replied that everything will be fine. Jose, with a fiery hand, said that he and Meyer would protect Kuro this time. The leader of the 1st squad thought that they should act. Even if one team member hid somewhere, they still wouldn't be able to defeat the 1st squad. The 1st squad of 4 members rushed to attack. The 9th squad of 3 people prepared to repel this attack. At this time, Li Han was on a tree branch from above, watching everything. In the battle of the captains, it wasn't necessary to destroy the entire team. It was enough to defeat the captain with the armband. Kuro was under the protection of Jose and Knut for the time being. Jose and Knut adopted battle stances in readiness to repel the 1st squad's attack. Jose swung his hot hand and prepared to strike the approaching opponent. Li Han stood on a branch and watched the battle taking place exactly below him. He was waiting for the opportune moment. Li Han thought they were almost there and mentally asked Kuro if he was ready. Kuro silently looked up, and that was his affirming answer. Li Han thought that Kuro could care less. They were well prepared this time. Li Han very effectively pushed off from the branch and jumped straight into the thick of the battle. The captain of the 1st squad was trying to attack Jose and Knut. He had already extended his arms to grab both opponents at once. Jose and Knut, seeing that their leader had pushed off the branch, pounced on the fat man themselves. He grabbed them tightly. The leader of the 1st squad said that was great. Now the captain has to hold these 2 tighter. The leader of the 1st squad said that nothing could protect Kuro now. Li Han was rapidly approaching the ground. The 2 cadets almost came close to Kuro and shouted that they had almost won. However, these 2 were very surprised. Kuro stood with his hands raised and looked up somewhere. He wasn't even paying attention to them. Being in front of Kuro, the two stopped and looked where their opponent was looking. Behind them, they saw a lot of smoke and nothing else. It all seemed extremely strange. The leader of the first squad realized that it was a trap. At that moment, Kuro exhaled and dropped his arms exhaustedly. When the smoke cleared, everyone saw that the captain of the first squad had been defeated. Jose and Knut looked very tired. Near the captain of the first squad, squatting down, was Lee Han. He had accomplished this mission. Lee Han held the captain's sash in his hand. He said that this was the end. Squad 13 had won. There was a moment of silence in front of the screen. No one understood how it had happened. The battle was over. Squad number 13 had won. Everyone was discussing, did Lee Han really jump off a tree branch? After all, it's at least 15 meters. Lee Han is really crazy. However, he's really cool. The audience erupted into applause again. Petrov smirked and thought that just a few minutes ago, all these people were throwing mud at Lee Han. However, it was expensive to show such a result every time. The cadets at the screen were discussing this guy. This is the one who was in the 7th squad but then left. The cadets didn't understand why the leader of the 7th squad hadn't used such a tough fighter before. Kato really didn't understand what this Lee Han was capable of. He heard all of this and was extremely angry. One day before the battle with the first squad, Lee Han and Kuro had practiced this exercise intensely. Lee Han would jump up and Kuro would try to guide him in flight. After this practice, Lee Han expressed his confidence that they wouldn't have any problems in a real battle. Kuro is awesome. Kuro said that Lee Han is much better. By the way, isn't he scared? Lee Han used a tall stepladder to practice this technique. Kuro said if they mess up, he'll only get a broken nose. But Lee Han will risk his life tomorrow. Controlling a person with telekinesis is very difficult. If it was easy, all the fighters would be flying by now. Lee Han decided that he would hide in a secluded place and wait for the moment to jump. We need to make sure that neither he nor the other team would get hurt during the fall. Lee Han hoped Kuro would take care of him. Kuro cried again and apologized that his friend had broken his arm. He felt it was his fault. Lee Han, smiling, said it was okay. There's no need to worry so much. After all, no one had died. The mission was difficult, but Kuro did a great job. Knut told Kuro not to blame himself. Without him, they couldn't have defeated that fat man. Jose said that until Lee Han's arm healed, they wouldn't have any team training. However, that turned out to be an incorrect statement. All the cadets received a message on their gadgets. There was information about a new training session. Air combat in 2 days. Squad 7 versus Squad 13. Instructor Grossman was visited by Kato Svoki. The instructor didn't expect Kato to come. Jose thought it was some kind of mistake. After all, one of them broke his arm. Should they really start a new battle? After all, it's automatically a loss. Knut added that they were to be the 7th squad. The opponents are just excited right now. Jose said it's not fair. We have to go and explain everything to the management. Do they even know what they're doing? Grossman told Suki that this is his squad's chance to win. Isn't he confident enough? Kato replied that even if Lee Han hadn't broken his arm, they would still have won. Grossman said that in that case, Kato could still do anything for his squad to win. Once outside the office door, Kato Swoki thought that the instructor wasn't listening to him at all. Lee Han told his friends to stop wailing. It wouldn't change anything. All they have to do is win. Lee Han admits that he doesn't have a strategy or even a rough plan this time, but he promises that he will figure out how to win. These words were heard by Kato Swoki, who happened to be behind him. He expressed his hope that it wasn't just a 3. Is Lee Han really confident that he can handle a broken arm? Lee Han said it's a bit of an inconvenience, but he thinks he'll have enough with one arm to kick Squad 7's ass. Kato said it's not so easy to kick ass in aerial combat. Did such a thought not occur to this genius? Lee Han replied that he would prepare something special this time. The 7th squad would be embarrassed if they didn't give it their best. Kato couldn't take it anymore and pumped that he would destroy Lee Han and Kuro. Lee Han interrupted and said with glassy eyes that Kato had never destroyed anyone in his life, so it's better not to throw such words around. The offended Kato left this company and said that they will see for themselves soon. Jose said that this Kato is actually a pathetic jerk. Lee Han concluded that it was definitely not going to be easy with Squad 7 and told everyone to move to the gym. In the gymnasium, Lee Han tried to influence the airboard with his energy abilities. The co-workers were training intensely, performing individual tasks. Lee Han thought that they would fail. Even with a healthy arm, he could only control a maximum of 2 airboards. Right now, he could barely manage one. Lee Han looked at Jose and thought that it was not an easy task for him to control 2 boards and a flame at the same time. The squad could only rely on Kuro. The 7th squad was also doing the same. But Lee Han didn't want to overburden this guy. Even without strong support, The seventh squad was well-balanced in terms of physical strength and telekinesis. Having Kato as the leader, having them work together makes the team much stronger. Lee Han knew that they wouldn't be able to win in a head-on collision with their opponents. Our hero had little time to work out tactics to do battle with the seventh squad, considering he had a broken arm. To top it all off, Jose came up and said that they had a real problem. Jose ignited his hand and held it out in front of him. He wanted to give a clear example. Jose explained that there was nothing in the air that could be ignited, so his fire would be of little use. Given the speed of movement on the board, it would be very difficult to aim. From the side, Lee Han was being watched. One of the people watching said that these guys talked so much with this level of training. The deputy told Kato that they shouldn't worry. The commander agreed with him. They should be fine. Lee Han, assessing the situation, thought that there was simply no way to win. Kato decided that there was no reason for them to lose. The cadets in the hall near the monitors were surprised. Did Squad 13 really have another battle to fight? After all, Lee Han had a broken arm. Everyone thought that they shouldn't participate in training for a while. Petrov thought it was hinting that the 13th squad would lose. Instructor Grossman is a real scoundrel. Simon and Petrov were in solidarity in this case. The 13th squad should not have been disturbed. Simon said that Grossman tries to give each team a chance to win, 50-50th somewhere. The type of training and the squads involved are determined by analyzing the information. Simon thought that Lee Han would really have a hard time this time. The 7th squad stood at the starting line. They had no doubts about their victory, although they realized that they would have to work hard. The 13th squad, led by their leader, knew that they were going to have a hard time. However, they were not going to give up. Kato said that they were ready to tear their opponents to shreds and show everyone what happens to traitors. Lee Han asked how Jose was feeling. Jose replied that he couldn't be better, ready to rock out, so there's no need to worry about him. Lee Han said to make sure Jose does his best today. He's the backbone of their strategy. The command has been given to start the fight. The squads must launch their airboards. The airboards of all the participants were launched and were at the starting point. The spectators were amazed at how many boards were now in the air. Are they really crazy? Someone counted 16 boards. The fight was going to be fierce. All the more spectacular this training should be. Kato was angry. He thought it was impossible. The sophomore fighters averaged 2 airboards, the supports 4. Some can't even hold those 2, and their opponents have 16. Even if they each hold 2 airboards, that still leaves 10. Kuro can't manage 10 boards. The aide waited for some kind of reaction from the commander. Lee Han said that Kato was definitely confused, but he was willing to explain something. The cadets of Squad 13 stood confidently. Behind them, 16 aeroboards were hanging in the air. The opponents were talking over each other, not realizing if this was even possible. Kato tried to reassure them and told them not to be afraid ahead of time. Svoki said that in any case they would stick to the plan. They should destroy the opponents one by one. Jose and Knut stood on the boards. Knut held a spear in his hand. Jose was ready to use fire if necessary. Lee Han thought that there was a reason why they didn't pause for rest during their training. Although his telekinesis abilities were below average, he had learned how to concentrate his powers at a desired point in his body. If Lee Han can develop this skill better than just controlling objects with telekinesis, he will be able to control much faster. The freeboards of Squad 13 were released and surrounded the cadets of Squad 7. Kato thought this was crazy. Would the opponents really use their aeroboards like this? They were moving too fast. However, as long as the airboard didn't reach its intended target, they could have time to react as well. Jose was blowing tongues of flame into the airspace. There aren't many flammable things during an aerial battle. Jose told the commander at the time that his fire abilities would not be of much use. However, Jose was not idle. He ignited his arm and moved towards his opponent. Lee Han had said the day before that Jose could still set something on fire during an aerial battle. A strong flash of flame, which turned into an explosion, formed right next to the cadets of the 7th squad. The spectators were surprised. What was it? Did an airborne plane explode? But they are not cheap. Although in battle it should not matter. You could blow them all up if you needed to. Lee Han would send the airboards directly at the opponents, and Jose would ignite and detonate them at the right time. Thus, 2 opponents were knocked off their boards and fell down. Kato yelled for his assistant to block. Otherwise, that way they would blow up all their boards. Instructor Grossman, seeing such mayhem, yelled for this fight to stop immediately. Kato and Grossman loudly shouted Lee Han's name. At this time, another airboard exploded. Lee Han stood in front of Grossman and thought, did he really call him out for watching silently for 10 minutes? It would have been easier with Sergeant Red. he would have just cussed him out and let him go. Grossman started talking. He squeezed out something like he was embarrassed to start it that way. Does Cadet Lee Han have any idea how much one airboard costs? Lee Han expressed his belief that one airplane costs quite a lot. He could not be more specific. Grossman added that if Lee Han were not a member of the ARC, he would be in debt for the rest of his life. Lee Han was surprised. He thought the instructor had invited him to discuss strategy. Grossman said that technically Lee Han hadn't broken any rules, but didn't he realize that it would cause a lot of controversy? Some instructors might have praised him for getting out of the situation that way. Grossman said that next time, Lee Han should warn in advance if he is thinking of doing something like this. Lee Han said he had a question. If they were fighting dragons, no one would have any questions and the instructor wouldn't ask about the cost of the airboard. After all, they must win at all costs. Isn't that the goal of all training? Grossman realized that the boy was right. The instructor stood up and said that Lee Han had gotten him. The cadet looked like someone he knew. Grossman looked into Lee Han's eyes and said that the kid's reasoning was correct. He would love to observe the cadet on the battlefield. The instructor said that the conversation was over and the cadet could be free to go. On the way out of the instructor's office, our hero met Kato Swoki, who had also appeared here to sort things out. The cadet immediately remembered a previous fight in which Kato had lost his board during an attack. The explosion that happened nearby was critical for Kato, and he could barely stay on his feet to avoid flying down. Lee Han, even with his injured arm, decided to attack his opponent. He rushed towards Kato Swoki. Kato didn't expect this collision. He realized that his opponent wanted to throw him off the board. That time, Lee Han succeeded. In the instructor's office, Kato said that even though Lee Han won the battle thanks to his poor strategy, no one would praise him for it. Lee Han wondered, had Kato been standing under the door all this time to tell him that? Kato replied that he was just passing by. As they parted, an angry Kato said that he would finish that boy off at any cost. He has no right to lose to someone else before their next meeting. Lee Han replied that they'll see about that. Lee Han entered the dorm room. The members of his squad were still celebrating their victory. They greeted the commander. Kuro, smiling, said that they had won. Jose added that he was afraid they would be disqualified for breaking the rules. Knut stated that they hadn't violated anything, but it was still scary. Jose looked at his gadget. Kuro asked what had happened. Jose replied that he gets a text message every time during the celebration. Knut looked at his gadget and saw the message too. The rest of the squad got the same message. The expression on everyone's faces changed at the same time. They were tensed. The message stated that there would be a capture the flag battle in 7 days. Squad 5 versus Squad 13. Petrov in the gym during a physical training session bench pressed a barbell from the chest. The cadet thought that putting another battle immediately after one, and even with the strongest opponent in this format, was overkill. Lee Han, smiling, said that it was very much in Grossman's style. The instructor seems to dislike him. Petrov was walking back through the compound to his dormitory after his physical workout. He thought he had done a good job today. Dmitri was hot and wanted to get to the shower as soon as possible. A senior cadet was walking towards Petrov. At some point, they equaled each other. The eyes of the young men met for a moment. Petrov at first wanted to pass by. When the young men had already separated, Petrov called out to the fellow. Dmitri called him and called him the leader of the squad, or rather the former leader of the squad if he was the leader now. Petrov took the guy by the shoulder and asked, would he really ignore him if he went to the 3rd year? Dmitri said that their squad had everything super now because he was the leader by right. The guy looked at Petrov with hatred and told him to back off or he would destroy him. Petrov was surprised. A strange smile froze on his face. What was wrong with this guy? Dmitri said he would like to hear all the details after their battle. Lee Han stood in the open with a spear in his hand. It was obvious from him that he was very tired. Our hero looked at his opponent. Who is this guy? He has incredible strength. The opponent held swords in his hands. A hood covered his eyes, and there was a mask on his face. The opponent in this case was the skull-masked man that Lee Han had met outside the instructor's office earlier. The distance between the opponents was shrinking. The unknown masked man didn't look tired. He was approaching Lee Han with an easy gait. In the next moment, the unbelievable happened. In front of Lee Han's eyes, the opponent disappeared. Where he had been standing just a moment ago, there was an empty space. After another moment, the opponent was up above Lee Han. He attacked our hero. The attack was unexpected, and Lee Han fell to his knees. 6 days before this fight, Lee Han had a conversation with instructor Grossman. The matter took place in the instructor's office. As the conversation continued, Grossman said that he could not reveal all the details. The instructor was speechless and looked directly into the cadet's eyes. The senior student whom Petrov met with after the training session pressed his opponent's head with his face to the ground. This guy's eyes were glowing furiously. Grossman, in recounting the situation to Li Han, emphasized the fact that Petrov was lying in a pool of his own blood. The instructor said that Dmitri was seriously injured and would not be able to participate in the next competition, but it would still take place as scheduled. Li Han thought that without Dmitri, the fifth squad would be like a chicken without a head. It could be said that victory was in their pocket. Grossman held out the papers to the cadet and said that there was another reason why he had called him in. The instructor said it was a request for transfer between squads. There are cadets who want to go to Squad 13. Grossman added that Li Han is known for knowing how to utilize the strengths of his fighters. The head of Squad 7, Kato, only gets negative feedback. Li Han knew that something like this could happen. Li Han thought that most sophomores wanted to compete on a level playing field. Grossman said that Li Han has time to think about it. Guy said that is not necessary. He's taking everyone. He's not in a position to pick and choose right now. The next day at the formation, the commander welcomed all the new recruits. In front of Li Han stood Domingo, Qasim, and Andy. The commander called them all by name. And of course, Zhang Qijo, this young man was the most confident. Li Han said that already from tomorrow they would start preparing for the competition. Right now, he wanted to look at their superpowers and determine the positions. One of the people present had a question and turned to the head of Li Han's squad. It was Zhang Qijo. He said that he didn't have a question but a request. He asked to take care of a fellow Korean. Li Han said that in the ARC, nationality doesn't matter. If someone wants to be taken care of, one has to prove themselves and show what they can do. Zhang Qijo said that he understood everything and still asks to be taken care of. Li Han turned around and said that this cadet is suspended for today. The rookie thought that this commander is a bore. Zhang Qijo turned around and swore at Li Han. He had an angry expression on his face. Zhang Qijo stuffed his hands into his pockets and left the area. His co-workers looked at him with astonishment. An hour before, there was a report that squad number 5 would be fighting squad number 13. Capture the flag. The cadets didn't realize what was happening. The roof of the stadium was closing in. Could this be a simulation of the night? Jose thought the instructors were trying to reduce their chances of winning. Li Han told his squad not to relax. Everyone will be in the same conditions. We have to wait until our eyes get used to the darkness. Li Han said Knut's team will go first, Jose's team will be in the back. Qijo, Kura, and Li Han will attack from the flank. Without Dmitri, the 5th squad is their easiest opponent so far, and he hopes that they can handle it without any problems. However, one must not let their guard down. They must definitely try their best. 10 minutes ago, Li Han commanded the first team to go forward. Jose received the command next. Li Han told the cadets that it was now their turn. 5 minutes ago, Knut and his team attacked the opponents powerfully. He expected that victory was almost in their hands. Li Han asked if all 5 of them had been taken down. Knut said there were more opponents near the flag. There was indeed another opponent near the flag. His face was hidden, a hood on his head. The opponent did not show any initiative and just sat with his swords folded next to him. Jose wondered, was he really just watching his partners get beaten up? In the next second, this warrior got to his feet and moved alone against the entire squad number 13. What happened stunned Li Han. All of his warriors that his opponent passed by were stunned. They had no chance to do anything in their defense. Li Han couldn't believe his eyes. How does this happen? Kuro warned Li Han to be careful. Just a moment later, the masked opponent was already beside Li Han. Our hero thought it was teleportation. Li Han swung his spear, but it was too late. He didn't even have time to be surprised. His opponent retreated to his original position. There were casualties in the ranks of the 13th squad. Li Han and Jose were still in formation for now. Jose told the commander that this guy couldn't even be approached. After saying that, Jose still tried to attack the opponent and clear the way to the flag. Jose lunged forward, standing his sword up. His opponent jumped up and did a somersault to get behind Jose. In the next instant, Jose was defeated. His opponent stood by his side with no injuries. Those watching at the monitors were amazed. Had the 13th squad been eliminated? Who was hiding behind the skull mask? There are many rumors about him. They say his name is Silence. The cadets passed that name on by word of mouth. Silence was indeed a rumor that made them shudder. Del Simon thought, is Silence really the same person? During his training, his central nervous system was damaged, causing him to lose the ability to speak. But right after that, his abilities began to develop at an astonishing rate, so they started experimenting on him. He's a 3rd year. Are 3rd-year students really that strong? How can they compete in the 2nd-year competition? The only survivor from Squad 13 was Li Han. He bent down and picked up his spear from the ground. Silence sauntered over next to him. Li Han said that he didn't know who his opponent was, but he definitely wasn't going to lose. Li Han nicknamed his opponent Skullface. Clearly, he wanted to make him angry. Li Han, clutching his spear tightly in his hand, moved to attack. Silence didn't stand still either and moved toward his opponent, swinging his swords. Simon thought that Silence was much stronger than all the sophomores. It wouldn't be difficult for him to deal with Li Han. Simon wondered, what would Li Han do? After all, he wouldn't be able to defeat Silence. Li Han thought if he doesn't block the attack, he will be finished, but he can't lose so easily. Li Han turned on his brainstorm and decided to think. This skull travels about 15 meters in a second, and it's unlikely that he's saving his strength, so he's probably going to move faster now. However, the goal of this competition is not to beat everyone, including this guy, but to capture the flag. If they manage to stop him, then they will win. Li Han believed that he could do it. One should stop the opponent the moment he uses his ability, start moving around. This could be seen by the blurred space around him. One must utilize the fact that the skull moves quickly. Silence approached our hero with lightning speed. Li Han crouched down, and that saved him. The opponent's sword whistled above his head. As he stood up, Li Han was about to deliver a powerful blow to his opponent's jaw. The blow was strong, but the opponent managed to dodge. Skull knocked Li Han to the ground and stepped on the chest of his lying opponent. As he did so, he swung his sword over his opponent. The gazes of the opponents met. At this, Li Han was smiling. To the skull, this was strange. Right above the skull's head, the spear that Li Han had previously tossed upwards was spinning. The spear came down and struck Silence on the head. After that, Silence lost control and Li Han was able to slip away from him. After a moment, Li Han stood with the opponent's flag in his hand. He said that after being hit, the masked man regained consciousness in 3 seconds. That's amazing. Li Han said that those 3 seconds were enough for him to grab the flag and added that the 13th squad had won. Those watching were shocked. Li Han had beaten a third-year student. He should have joined the 13th squad. Del Simon clenched his fists harder. Of course, no one had expected this outcome. Kuro beckoned the kitten over and gave it some food. He said it was a good kitten. There was also a cat living near his orphanage. They were very much alike. Kuro said he had no friends when he was a child. He didn't have any outstanding talents either, and he didn't look like everyone else. Kuro added that now he had something he was good at and friends. Kuro was approached by a cadet. The man thought, what kind of loser talks to a cat? Of himself, this guy thought his abilities were much cooler. Kuro looked around and asked when Kijo had time to approach. Kijo suggested that they talk about something on their day off. Kijo asked Kuro, since they don't have a deputy on their squad right now, right? Kijo said he wanted to take the position. It wouldn't be a bad idea if Kuro supported him for the position. At that, the cat rubbed against his leg. Kijo swore and kicked the cat with his foot. Kuro looked at that kitten with fear. He felt sorry for the animal. Kijo watched the kitten run away. Kuro immediately pushed it aside. Kuro stood up to his full height next to his companion. He was displeased with Kijo's behavior. Kuro's eyes shone with anger. His hair stood up. He was ready to destroy Kijo. His opponent was startled and took a few steps back. He didn't expect such a reaction from Kuro. Kuro cast a glance at the trash can, and that container faltered. The next moment, the trash can shrunk like a piece of paper and flew far away into the bushes. Kijo even cried out in fear. Kuro angrily told that guy to never do that again. Kijo squatted down and frightened said he wouldn't do it again, and asked Kuro to calm down. Kuro ran after the kitten that had disappeared among the trees. Kijo, frightened, stayed on the ground. The kitten continued to run away from people to a safe place where no one could hurt it. Dmitri sat on the bed with his head bandaged. He said that Li Han had come to him for a reason. What did he want? Li Han sat silently in front of his interlocutor. There were marks on his face from the last battle. Li Han said that it was only his guess, and he thought Ark was not telling him something, but when he saw the interlocutor, everything became clear. Li Han asked that Petrov was attacked by the third year, right? Petrov, clutching his head, said it was the former head of his squad. Third-year students are different. Third years aren't just different, they're unrealistically stronger. Petrov added that before he could even move, he had already been smeared. It was the first time Li Han had seen his interlocutor so upset. Petrov added that the guy wasn't himself, like he was out of his mind. Li Han said that if he wasn't like that from the beginning, it might be because of the training in the third year. Come to think of it, there is almost no equipment for third-year students in ARC, and it's not easy to meet them here at all. Li Han said that going to the second year isn't that difficult. This means that before graduation, they will face a real battle. Petrov agreed with his interlocutor. What might happen to them during the transition? Kuro happily ran with all his legs. He finally found that kitten. The kitten didn't run away. Kuro lifted the kitten in front of him and said he was sorry that the kitten was hurt. He was going to take the kitten with him and give it more goodies. Kuro turned around. What he saw frightened him and the kitten in his arms. A strange human-like creature asked Kuro who he was. Kuro's voice sounded familiar. He had definitely heard it somewhere before. The strange creature threw back the mask from its head, and Kuro recognized the person inside that spacesuit. The person inside the spacesuit was Sergeant Red. The sergeant recognized Kuro and said that this guy had changed a lot. He had matured a lot. ARC Development Center. Sergeant Red said Kuro has wandered far. Is he really lost? John Red offered Kuro a can of soda and said the kid would be picked up soon and taken to his dorm. Kuro thanked him. Opening the can of soda, Kuro wondered if Sergeant Red was angry. The sergeant wondered what he was angry about. Was it because Kuro had ended up here? John Red said he was wearing telekinesis armor, second-generation telekinesis armor. It's still in the testing phase, but it'll be announced soon. There's nothing wrong with Kuro seeing it a little earlier. Second-year students can't leave the ARC of their own accord anymore anyway. Kuro agreed. After the reinforcement, they can't leave the ARC unless they completely lose their fighting ability. Of course, they're a resource for the ARC after all. The sergeant said that's right, and those who get angry for no reason are just scum. Kuro agreed with him, didn't he? Kuro was surprised to hear the sergeant's words. Does he even realize what he's saying? An old man entered the room. The old man asked Sergeant Red how the test went. John Red replied that the armor reacted perfectly to telekinesis. The sergeant suggested that it would be worth reducing the amount of dragon flesh material for the internal system. It was important to increase its power, but if it was so sensitive, it would be harder to control. John Red put his hand on Kuro's shoulder. Unlike them, the first generation, these guys calibrating their telekinesis will be as easy as taking a breath. The old man held out his hand to Kuro and said it was a pleasure to meet him. He is the head of the first group, Charles Smith. A startled Kuro also extended his hand and introduced himself. The sergeant said this old man creates tele-armor. He's a legend. Smith said that the first generation tele-armor was assembled in a hurry, so it had certain flaws. The second generation is much better. It will probably be the most advanced weapon. John Red, turning to Kuro, said that this body armor was specially designed for them. Personally, he could barely operate it. Kuro wondered, would he really have to wear the suit he had seen the sergeant in? Kuro pictured himself in that tele-armor, standing against a horde of monsters. He felt uneasy. Would he really have to participate in a real battle? As the day drew to a close, Sergeant Red told Kuro that they would see each other again. John Red, puffing on his cigar, asked Smith what would happen to the armor he had tested today. The old man replied that it would be taken apart and worked on separately. They didn't have much dragon material after all. The sergeant asked if they should hold on to the armor sample for now. There's no telling who might need that armor and at what point. The day at the ARC starts at 5 o'clock in the morning, but Lee Han gets up at 4 a.m. He wakes up early to write down strategies for battles, outstanding traits of squad members, or other features at that time. Of course, he always prescribes and evaluates his abilities on par with the rest of the squad. Our hero's telekinesis is still below average. In other words, there's not much use for it. He can't even use the absolute ability of telekinesis, which the instructor Wei Chang told him about. However, the guy had managed to discover an ability that only he possessed among the sophomores. This ability was absolute accuracy when using telekinesis. Kuro and Simon are able to use telekinesis to turn a pencil into a powerful weapon, but they can't write with it. When it comes to control, Lee Han is superior to the others. He should train much more to improve his accuracy. Lee Han looked at the time and decided that it was time for him to go already. In the morning training session, as always at the beginning, there was running in a circle. The entire squad participated in it. Many were in a sleepy state. Today, our hero was caught up with Dmitry Petrov. Lee Han asked what Dmitry thought about yesterday's spatial crack. Petrov said that in general it was nothing special, except that it was very bright. The spatial crack is the trace left after the Battle of the Dragon units and the closing of the gate. Under Grossman's orders, the sophomores were split into two groups and sent to inspect the crack. Instructor Grossman explained that spatial cracks are places where the Earth and the other world intersect. They are believed to be the reason why people with telekinesis abilities appeared in this world. Grossmana said it would be good for the cadets to see the crack. It's not dangerous, so there's no need to worry. This crack was formed more than 10 years ago and has not been active until now. Lee Han told Petrov that he has heard that telekineticists experience strange sensations when approaching the crack. Petrov noticed that he starts to feel a little dizzy. It's hard to describe. Li Han will see for himself today. Petrov overtook everyone and told them to push on. Jose, as usual, said he didn't feel like running. After physical training, Li Han told his squad that they would be meeting at the helipad at 10 a.m. After breakfast and showers, they have free time, so it's up to them to decide what to do. Jose, laughing, said that it feels like he and his class are going on a field trip. A cadet approached Li Han and asked if they could have breakfast together. Li Han recognized him. It was John, the head of Squad 10. The interlocutor said that he was pleased that Li Han remembered his name. After defeating Silence, Grossman didn't want them to lose to anyone, much less easily. However, a few defeats did come their way. The 10th squad was one of those who were able to defeat them. Li Han, while talking to him, said that he always took his strategies into consideration, so he wanted to talk to him about it. John replied that he couldn't compare to Li Han in this. After the meeting at the helipad, the squad loaded aboard and departed in the designated direction. In the helicopter, the instructor said that they were heading to Shinjuku, one of the 6 places that had opened up due to the interdimensional gate during the time of the first invasion. The Dragon Squad sent there split into 2 squads and headed to different countries. The northern part of Korea was wiped out by the dragons. The government was eliminated and citizens began to cross the demilitarized zone. The southern part took in refugees while defending against the monster invasion. However, the country still hadn't recovered from the social and financial crisis of the time. Li Han recognized that he and Kijo were born there. The helicopters arrived at their destination point. It was Shinjuku. The instructor announced that they were approaching the crevasse, and the command was given to open the rear hatch. Through the open rear hatch of the helicopter, the cadets felt something incredible. This was a sensation they had never experienced before. They were under some strange pressure. Li Han had the feeling that he would be swallowed up by something at any moment. The helicopter was flying over the dragon's open mouth at this moment. The cadets looked down, holding their breath. They couldn't even utter a word. This was the first time this had happened to them. The helicopters continued on. They continued to descend. Lightning could be seen up ahead, and there were rumbles of thunder. Jose said he wanted to go home, wash up, and go to bed. Kuru pronounced that he felt very neat. The 3rd cadet said he was very tired even though he hadn't done anything yet. Li Han looked out the porthole. There was another helicopter flying very close to them. In the neighboring helicopter, through the porthole, Li Han saw the squad leader of Squad 10, John, through the porthole. The young men looked at each other and greeted each other. In the next moment, the unbelievable happened. A strange glow appeared inside the neighboring helicopter. A moment later, that helicopter exploded into small fragments. The moment the helicopter glowed from within, Li Han thought, what was that light? Was the 10 squad no longer there? Li Han remembered that this morning was the first time he had said hello to Squad 10's commander. The instructor grabbed Li Han by the shoulder and shouted that there was an emergency. It was necessary for everyone to leave the helicopter. The helicopter that Squad 13 was traveling in caught fire. He was in an emergency descent. It could go into free fall at any moment. It is urgent to get off the board. All the cadets on board put on their parachutes and moved to the open hatch. In a hurry, the cadets began to leave the aircraft and further descend to the ground on parachutes. The instructor shouted that no one should stay on board. Everyone must leave it. Li Han replied that they were doing so. The instructor instructed that as soon as they landed, Li Han should gather the entire squad and wait for them to come for them. If the chief instructor didn't show up, Li Han should take command. Li Han was dumbfounded by the situation. Li Han pushed off and jumped. After he left the board, there was an explosion in the helicopter. With the blast wave, Li Han was thrown aside. Good thing he hadn't opened his parachute yet. Some time later, approaching the Earth by parachute, Li Han saw the horrifying picture again. Among the wreckage of the helicopter, Li Han saw the instructor burning. Unfortunately, he could not leave the helicopter in time. Since there were trees under his feet, Li Han could not land properly and hung on the tree branches. Our hero decided not to get discouraged and first of all to calm down. After all, this was what they were training for. Some of the cadets could be injured, panicked, or unable to move at all. He must find and rescue all the cadets. It was necessary to gather them together. Li Han decided to free himself from the parachute and walk towards the smoke and fire. There will be wreckage from the helicopter or a signal from Jose. The guy got a sling cutter and cut the slings holding him to the parachute. After that, he managed to jump to the ground. Li Han looked around and chose a route, moving in the given direction. Our hero sensed that there was someone hiding in the bushes on the right. He immediately drew his dagger and prepared to defend himself in case the unknown person attacked. Jong Kijo came out of the bushes. How did he end up here? Kijo said he watched the helicopter and waited for the commander to land. He assumed Li Han would be the last one to jump. In situations like this, the first thing to do was to find the squad leader. Li Han thought that this cadet had come to a reasonable conclusion under extreme circumstances. He had underestimated him before. Li Han told the cadet that they should find the others. Following the assigned route, the commander said they should break branches along the way so they wouldn't get lost. The young men approached the burning helicopter, but there were hardly any survivors. Li Han said that it was the second team. The 8th squad must have been in this helicopter. Looking into the interior of the blazing helicopter, the cadets saw the bodies of the dead. Kijo felt sick at what he saw. He thought he could have been in their shoes. Kijo stepped aside and leaned against a tree. He didn't want Li Han to see him in this state. Looking at his commander, Kijo wondered, did he really have any nerves left? He didn't even twitch. Does it really not affect him at all? Li Han replied that these weren't the first corpses he'd seen. In ARC, people die from time to time. Kijo replied that what he saw was too much. Li Han looked up and saw a huge monster standing not far in front of him, leaning its front paws against the fuselage of the helicopter. Li Han immediately guessed that the werewolf in front of him was now a werewolf. Li Han calmly told Kijo to find something useful in the helicopter, and he would try to distract the werewolf. Kijo suggested that they just run away. Li Han said that if they turn their backs on the monster, they're dead men. The monster is much faster than them. It is necessary to finish it off here and now. The werewolf climbed over the fuselage and leisurely walked towards the cadets. He felt like the king of the situation. The monster threw something resembling a whip over Li Han's arms and began to wrap them around. Li Han shouted for Kijo to hurry up. Kijo immediately rushed into the pre-burning helicopter. Li Han resisted the werewolf. In one hand, he held a dagger. Kijo ran past him. Kijo was very scared. He just wanted to escape, but that was wrong, wasn't it? Li Han cut whatever the werewolf had thrown at him. This freed his hands. Li Han shouted to his colleague to get inside the helicopter immediately. The werewolf pounced on our hero. The guy managed to slip away and tried to run aside. The monster made a jump and found himself in front of Li Han. He put his paw forward with the desire to grab his victim. Kijo stood in front of the blazing helicopter. He was scared to go inside to where the corpses were. He thought that if he fought the werewolf, he would die. But he could escape while the monster was busy with Li Han. At some point, Chong Kijo grabbed his face and shouted that he was a rascal. Kijo turned around and ran. He shouted that he was not a coward who would abandon his partner. Li Han was still holding on and fought back as best he could. Kijo made his way aboard, but regretfully noticed that there were no shells on board. Only a metal bar came to hand. Li Han cut the werewolf's ropes, binding him again. He noticed that this monster was regenerating. The werewolf opened its mouth. Li Han swung his knife and thought he was finished. The monster grabbed the cadet with its front paws, and it seemed that Li Han was already doomed. However, Kijo appeared in front of Li Han and the monster. Li Han looked at him. The monster also slowed down for a moment. Kijo held a long stick in his hand, with a dagger tied to the end of it. With his other hand, he threw a rock. Kijo apologized for being away for a very long time. The monster turned around and moved at Kijo. The stone flew and hit the monster. This made him angry. Kijo thought that Li Han would understand his plan and react correctly. He's a smart guy after all. Kijo swung the makeshift spear and threw it forward. The werewolf was approaching Kijo. At that time, the spear flew over him towards Li Han, who was behind the monster at that moment. The werewolf knocked Kijo off his feet and ended up above him. The wild beast opened its mouth and was ready to tear the cadet apart. The predator's teeth were in close proximity to Kijo's face. He could even smell the stench coming from the werewolf's mouth. The next moment, a spear came out of the monster and stopped right in front of Kijo's face. The monster was pierced through. Li Han stood on top of the defeated werewolf. From its body, he pulled out an improvised spear. The dead werewolf fell to the ground, crushing Kijo with its body. The boy wondered if the beast was really dead. Li Han extended a hand to his colleague. Kijo, wiping the beast's blood from his face, said that it looked like it was falling apart. The commander helped his cadet up and, holding him up, took him aside. He said help from the ARC would be here soon. We must hold out. The gathered cadets made a fire. They hoped that Li Han would notice the smoke from the fire and come to help. Kuro said the commander was nearby. Jose agreed, for their leader always makes the best decision. The cadet noticed that Squad 13 really trusted their leader. Remembering his behavior in the competition, he could see why that was so. Kuro looked back at the rustling coming from the bushes. He turned around and thought it was Li Han. However, it was the 9th squad. The cadets approached the campfire in a friendly formation. Knut asked. Were there 6 of them? Did their helicopter crash too? One of the cadets answered that no. The cadet added that they had been attacked. Their instructor and leader were killed. They dragged their feet and miraculously survived. Jose and Knut wondered if the 9th squad had seen a werewolf. 2 men came out of the bushes. Li-Han and Kijo finally appeared. Kijo continued to limp, and the commander supported him. The cadets said that there were 3 monsters from the Ella tribe. They handled the werewolf as if he were their tame dog. A frightened cadet asked what they would do if they had no weapons or equipment. Would they all die? Another cadet asked. Li-Han decided to stop panicking and told everyone to be quiet. The guy added that he had a plan and asked everyone to trust him. He said for no one to panic. Li-Han said that although help is on the way, it will take them about 5 hours to get there. They need to make a shelter and defend themselves until help arrives. 2 hours passed. All the preparations were finished. The area was protected by special structures on all sides. If they were ordinary people, they wouldn't have succeeded without equipment. But since everyone possessed telekinesis, the impossible became possible. The cadets also lit a torch. It was very bright because werewolves can see very well in the dark, and their sense of smell is also developed. This torch was for the rescue expedition. Li-Han said, "All that remains is to wait." Knut walked up to the commander and asked him a question, saying he wanted to hear the answer while no one else was around. Knut asked what happens if help arrives, but that helicopter also crashes. Is RK even aware of the situation? Li-Han replied that they will think about it if that happens. Right now, their job is to survive. We need to concentrate on strategy. Knut assumed that the commander had already calculated everything. Knut had decided that real battles were very grueling. Those RK competitions were nothing like the real thing. The cadets heard a noise coming from different directions. They immediately grabbed their prepared weapons and took a circular defense. Li-Han shouted that now it was Kuro's turn. Kuro was ready and used his abilities, straining as hard as he could. Thanks to Kuro, a protective sphere appeared above the makeshift base. The cadets hoped that the monsters wouldn't be able to overcome it. Jose was extremely surprised after being amazed by Kuro's strength. When had he only learned this? The enemy appeared right in front of Li-Han and Knut. He looked like a fire monster. Li-Han ordered the spears to be prepared for battle. He, along with Knut, shifted to attack. Li-Han ordered the cadets to hurl the spears with telekinesis and only think about the throw. The cadets wouldn't be able to throw well if they thought about defense. The first attack was successful, and the attacking monster received its portion of spears. Li-Han told Knut that they should do it right now. Li-Han and Knut surrounded the beast and began to strike it from different directions. The monster screamed loudly in pain. The beast with spears sticking out of it crawled backwards while continuing to scream loudly. Li-Han asked Kuro where the next closest monster was. Kuro announced that it was on the opposite side, and there were 2 of them. Li-Han ordered Jose to set fire to the barricades on the side where those monsters were coming from. Jose immediately used his abilities to set the defenses on fire. The monsters, after receiving a portion of burns, retreated backwards. Li-Han said that the monsters had stopped for now and gave the command to destroy whoever climbed over the fence first. One of the werewolves jumped over the flaming fence, hoping to attack the cadets. Li-Han commanded that this beast be attacked. Another monster jumped over the fence. The first one, which had received a portion of spears, went up in flames. Li-Han ordered the spears to be prepared. However, the monster moved into a deafening defense, hoping to wait until the cadets ran out of spears. Li-Han was surprised. Could this monster really think? It shouldn't be able to think. He ordered Kijo to follow him. Li-Han jumped high up above the monster and swung his spear, expecting to hit the monster through its open mouth. The werewolf opened its mouth and roared loudly. At that moment, the cadet thrust his spear into it. Kijo thrust the spear into the monster's mouth and received a portion of its blood splatter in return. Kuro shouted for Kijo to be careful, for it was very dangerous. Li-Han pulled Kijo back. He managed to do it just in time. The monster was struck dead, and its breathless body slumped to the ground. Improvised spears were sticking out of it from all sides. However, Kijo had received a penetrating wound. He angrily said that his clothes were now torn. In the next moment, Kijo couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. Li-Han shouted loudly. Kuro, apologizing, said that it couldn't be avoided, but it was better this way than falling into the werewolf's jaws. Li-Han realized that it was an arrow, so Ella's hunters are somewhere. He asked Kuro where the hunters were and added that it was time for a reserve group. The reserve was the ace up the sleeve that Li-Han had prepared. It was a secret 3-man squad. All of them were armed with daggers. Li-Han knew that when they thought it was over, Ella's hunters would show up on their own. The commander said that the cadets should climb onto the boards and use telekinesis to move. They just have to pretend they're air boards. When Kuro finds out where the hunters are hiding, the reserve will be sent there. He won't put up a protective barrier until he sees the opponents. It will be necessary to destroy them before then. Everything went exactly as Lee Han had envisioned. Kuro was finally exhausted. The guy said that he couldn't take it anymore. Lee Han thought that their strength was running out. If there were still enemies around, they would have to retreat. Besides, they had wounded people. A noise was heard in the forest. Apparently, the monsters were approaching, so they hadn't been left alone yet. Those who could stand on their feet were taken into a circular defense. They were Lee Han, Kuro, Jose, and Knut. Lee Han knew that the monsters would try to surround them, but their leader must be somewhere. The commander saw one monster that stood out among the others. It was a white monster. It must be the leader. It was a werewolf with consciousness. Our hero began to despair. They were left outnumbered. Monsters from all sides were arriving. What to do? Lee Han lifted his head up and looked at the night sky. He saw lights approaching. Lee Han realized that they could survive. The guy ordered everyone to take out their spears. This was the crucial moment, and one must not let up. The monsters were climbing over the fence and approaching the cadets. It was necessary to hold on just a little longer. Kuro, bleeding, thought that he should exert himself a little more. A lot depended on him now. Each of the cadets tried to use their telekinesis abilities. This was especially true for Kuro. The glowing dots were getting closer. It was a rescue expedition. The helicopters were landing. Help had arrived after all. Explosions began to sound in the forest. It was destroying monsters. Our heroes ducked to avoid the effects of the blast. An armed warrior in a protective spacesuit came out of a container that had descended to the ground. On his helmet, he had the word "Red" written on it. The cadets realized that Instructor John Red had come to their aid, and it was a correct assumption. John Red thought, did these cadets really survive? Jose looked up at the sun and thought it was a miracle. He was enjoying his peaceful life. Knut, his bandaged hand sitting next to him, said that half the cadets had died that day. However, they had managed to survive. Jose remarked that it was amazing. That shield they had built. The werewolves had tried to destroy them with the whole pack, and they had been cut through like a hot knife through butter. Sergeant Red and his colleagues successfully carried out the operation to destroy the monsters. Jose added that although they were terribly scared at that moment, afterward, everyone celebrated and rejoiced that they had won the battle. Lee Han behaved with restraint. Knut looked at his commander carefully. Lee Han had been looking gloomy since his return and was constantly thinking about something. Since the cadets had returned, all squad quarrels and competitions had become meaningless. Kato Swoki came up to our hero and said that he couldn't stand him before, but now he was glad to meet him. As Lee Han said before, he was not ready to destroy anyone as well as to watch such events. Kato added that he only now realized who their real enemy really was. Lee Han thought that it was silly to even compare their strengths. They should become much stronger. There was a knock on the young man's door. It must have been knocking for a long time, but he didn't pay attention, because the door cracked from the heavy knock and a hole was formed in it. Lee Han even flinched in surprise. Through the hole formed, a hand with a gadget with a message above it had entered inside. It said that Lee Han was being summoned. He should come as soon as possible. This was an urgent gathering. It was necessary to appear right now. Lee Han had covered the hole in the wall, of course. But why did he need to make it in the first place? He left the room and followed the person who came after him. It was silence. Lee Han thought that this man was clearly a fucked-up person. Lee Han inquired who had scheduled the meeting. In response, Silence stood up to type a message on his gadget. Silence raised his hand. Lee Han read the message about what the sergeant was gathering, and Silence doesn't want Lee Han to bother him anymore. Our hero thought he didn't like this guy because he beat him at capturing the flag. The young men entered the ARC headquarters. They were already waiting for them. Lee Han walked up and asked if Sergeant Red had summoned him. In addition to the sergeant, Del Simon was also present. Lee Han and Del Simon silently looked at each other. They didn't speak to each other at all. Sergeant Red told them to have a seat. They're here for the long haul. At the leadership meeting, it was announced that a quarter of the entire sophomore class had died in the incident. And this was only a training exercise, not even a war. Chief of Staff Alexander Lacour said that they should interrogate the commander and find out the whole truth behind this unprecedented incident that seriously damaged the assets of the ARC. Lacour added that this is the final decision of the Supreme Council, so an enormous responsibility fell on the shoulders of Chief Instructor Grossman. It was necessary to discuss what had happened. Judging by the recordings from the helicopter cameras, the attack was organized by Ella's mages, but it was necessary to hear the opinion of everyone present. The battle was only fought against werewolves and low-ranked monsters like Ella's hunters. The instructor said that the monsters attacked and struck first, and this was the first time since the war that they had shown up to humans so calmly. Ella's magics can open the gate as far as they know. The war could start much sooner than predicted, should they awaken the Oracle. John Red says the only available letter for the new team's name is B. We have to choose, white or whiskey. Simon, Lee Han, and Silence sat there without saying a word. Lee Han thought that this was a temporary special operations squad. Would they really have such a lineup? Silence showed his gadget that had one word on it, white. The choice was made. Simon said he was in favor. Lee Han also joined in. Sergeant John Red said that's great. He will fix the team name, Whiskey. The instructor said they will now go through the whole assignment point by point. The chief of staff said it would be helpful to go to the Oracle now, but there may come a moment when his help will be indispensable. Alexander Lacour asked what Sergeant Red thought about it. The sergeant said that the Oracle could be avoided if there was permission for him to create a new team. The chief of staff wondered, what team are we talking about? John Red said they would take them prisoner and torture them. It's the easiest method to learn everything about the enemy. Simon, Silence, and Lee Han realized that they had to capture Ella's mages in Shiniju. The young men were met by Engineer Octo and greeted the sophomores. Octo was a nickname. His real name was Siegfried Schumacher. He said that the cadets should choose one basic dragon weapon each to begin with. Lee Han picked up a spear and thought, this is what a dragon weapon looks like. Lee Han saw that this weapon started to glow. Octo noticed that the dragon alloy memorized the fighter's telekinesis energy. Simon held a sword in his hand. He asked if there were more weapons, such as a slightly narrower and longer blade. Octo said that personalized weapons are provided in the third year. They can't be riveted in one day. Octo said they were moving on to the next element and suggested a strange-looking orb. The cadets stared in amazement at the orb hovering above their palm. Octo said it was a lightweight and compact version of the airboard. He had removed all functions except personal control. Lee Han was in full uniform with his weapon, and the backpack with the airboard was on his back. The cadets loading into the helicopter were wished good luck. The situation developed in such a way that there was no time to swing. The squad of our heroes arrived at the interdimensional rift in Shiniju. The commander said that to prevent the helicopter from being hit, they would walk to their destination. Sergeant John Red reported that the operation is called Catch the Magician. The mission is to capture Ella's magician alive and return to base. The search will be handled by Silence, Lee Han, John Red, and Simon. Lee Han thought that this was his first real combat assignment. Inwardly, he thought he was quite prepared. Lee Han asked Sergeant Red why send him on the operation. After all, there are third-year students who are much stronger. The sergeant replied that if evaluating overall combat skills, he would agree. However, in terms of strategy, the situation was different. The group under Lee Han's command survived without any equipment at all, and moreover, managed to deal with the monster. The sergeant added that this was not Lee Han's only strength. Most of the guys who came back from that training had suffered greatly psychologically. Once in a dangerous environment like the battlefield, people would break down at some point. From this point of view, one of the monsters in that clearing was precisely Lee Han. The sergeant said that he even thought that Lee Han was a real psycho. The only thing that Lee Han lacked right now was combat experience. Lee Han realized why Sergeant Red had chosen him and Simon. The cadets watching the events through the screen thought it was crazy. Lee Han even outranked the third-year cadets. At that moment, Del Simon looked at the screen and clenched his fists with all his might. Del Simon in this operation was determined to show Lee Han and Silence who was the best fighter here. The sergeant called a halt and said that they would take turns on duty. We should split into two teams, Silence and Lee Han, John Red and Del Simon. This small squad set up amongst the ruins of an old building. There was silence all around and it seemed like no one was here but them. Simon and Red were on duty. Silence and Lee Han were resting. Lee Han took off his helmet and thought that now that forest was right in front of them. Lee Han remembered the guys in his squad who didn't come back from that operation. He knew the chances were slim, but those guys could still be out there somewhere. Lee Han noticed that Silence intended to take off his helmet. Lee Han turned his head in his direction. Silence put the helmet back on. Lee Han said that he would turn his head away now, so Silence could take off his helmet. No one will see his face. Silence decided to use the gadget to create a message for Lee Han. Then he waved his hand and that message appeared on his helmet. It said that he wasn't hot. Lee Han replied as he pleased. After a while, an explosion sounded not far behind the forest. All four of them gathered together again and took up a circular defense. The sergeant said that all communications from now on would not work on the usual frequencies. They would be using the local squad network. The warriors spread out and began to scour the area for monsters. Something caught Silence's attention. Hiding behind a tree, he looked out in the direction the sound was coming from. Silence saw two of Ella's minions up ahead. They were armed. Over the intercom, Silence informed his companions that the monsters were approaching. The sergeant signaled to the team to keep quiet and keep their heads down. The sergeant ordered Silence to deal with these monsters. It didn't take long for Silence to react. In the blink of an eye, both monsters lost their heads. A sign appeared on Silence's faucet. The end. The sergeant thought that this warrior has all the messages prepared in advance. He's a real lunatic. Li Han thought that this person was like a cheater in real life. Silence cautiously crouched down. Another monster appeared nearby. Looking out from behind a tree, Silence saw that there were two of them. Silence took out two balls and prepared to deal with these two as well. Li Han suggested not to do that. Li Han offered to follow them. The sergeant inquired how to do that. Li Han said that these monsters are heading towards the crack. They are behaving calmly. It looks very much like they are doing reconnaissance. The sergeant agreed with Li Han and even praised him. He told Silence to follow them and they would keep their distance. Simon remained unhappy with the fact that it was Li Han who took the initiative and not him. Simon wanted to destroy these monsters, but they would still see who was better, him or Li Han. Silence lived up to his nickname and silently followed the monsters. He turned on the recording mode and everyone in his squad was able to follow what was happening. At the very edge of the crack was Ella's mage. Holding a wand with a crystal on top of it, the mage was performing some manipulations. Monster guards flocked to him from different directions. The sergeant told everyone to pay attention to the crystal on the wand. It was actually a telekinetic crystal. Everyone should have heard of such crystals during training. Li Han and Del Simon began to look at this crystal very carefully. Could this really be it? The crystal allows you to store a huge amount of energy for telekinesis. Magicians must have used them to shoot down helicopters. The crystal is probably charging right now. Judging by the brightness, it's probably holding more than one charge. In total, the sergeant counted 1 mage and 6 fighters. That's a total of 7 hostiles. Good thing there were no werewolves around. The sergeant has issued a new order. Everyone must regroup with Silence. It is necessary to proceed with the catch the mage operation. Ella's mage can teleport. We need to catch him before he notices the enemies. Silence will go first and grab the object. The rest of the squad must deal with the remaining fighters. They have no margin for error. Looking at the ritual going on, Li Han thought it was bright as day. He was interested in what was near the altar. Li Han sharpened his focus and saw that the missing ARC cadets were lying in front of the altar. They were still alive. Li Han was able to make out Quasim and Domingo. The sergeant was concerned. He could see the telekinesis coming out of Li Han. What's going on with this guy? If this continues, they'll all be in danger. That's because Ella's mages can find the source of the telekinesis. The sergeant thought they might be powerless here. John Red ordered the Whiskey Squad to retreat immediately. Because of Li Han, they might be detected. Del Simon and Silence were puzzled. What's going on? The sergeant replied to keep an eye on Li Han. There was still no way Li Han could calm down. John Red thought that this energy was obviously not enough for them to be found, but they should make sure that more didn't appear. However, what most didn't want to happen happened. Ella's mage had discovered Li Han. Now time was ticking down to seconds. Sergeant Red immediately rushed towards Li Han. Ella's mage attempted to destroy the detected opponent. The sergeant managed to push Li Han aside. John Red grabbed Li Han by the collar and dragged him away into the bushes. The mage's attack came to nothing. Li Han screamed loudly. Sergeant Red said to the cadet, "Did he finally wake up?" Li Han was horrified to see that the sergeant was injured. His leg was injured. The sergeant said that when he couldn't fight, Li Han should take command. Now he must run away urgently. Sergeant said they are retreating and asked for cover. Del Simon and Silence prepared to cover their comrades' retreat. Li Han picked up the commander by the shoulder and helped him move back to a safe zone. Li Han scolded himself. He realized that he was the reason why the sergeant was injured. How could he not restrain and control himself? Ella's mage shouted loudly, warning of danger. The monster waved his staff and his fighters rushed in pursuit of the men. Silence turned around and swung his sword. He was ready to take the fight. Silence immediately dealt a staggering blow to the approaching monster. However, the man was able to block the man's attack. Simon stood on the edge of the cliff and was ready to fight the monsters approaching him. The warrior took aim and opened a machine gun line. He decided to destroy the enemy using ammunition. Simon reprimanded himself and began to use his telekinesis abilities. He pulled 2 huge layers of earth out of the ground. The next moment, those 2 pieces of earth flew into the approaching enemies. One of the monsters was destroyed. Not to waste any time, Simon immediately rushed at the other monster, deciding to destroy it in hand-to-hand combat. The monster was armed and swung his sword at Simon. Simon thought, is this really the end? However, help came to him. A colleague with 2 swords instantly appeared beside the monster and sliced it in half. Silence appeared just in time and saved his comrade. Simon and Silence looked at each other. The destroyed monster lay between them. Magella continued to shout something loudly. Magella's fighters turned around and headed towards him. Simon wondered why the enemies had lost interest in them. Simon and Silence approached the rest of the squad. Li-Han kept thinking that he was the reason the operation had failed. Or Tree sat the exhausted sergeant. He bandaged himself and injected the necessary medication into his body. Part of his leg was missing. Now they would have to abandon the plan and improvise. The enemies would be watching them. Someone suggested retreating. Li-Han said he was against it. They would work on a new plan. Silence was furious and wanted to punish Li-Han. However, Simon held him back. They should definitely calm down now. Simon tried to calm down Silence. It was understandable why he was angry at Li-Han. But right now, he was the one who was their commander. And if Silence was in the way, he wouldn't just stand by and watch. Silence made it clear that he had calmed down and there would be no further conflict. Simon said that everyone realizes that this happened because of him. If he pulls anything else, no one will be nice to him, and he'll get it in the neck before they get back to the ARC. Simon added, now they're all listening to what Li-Han came up with. He hated to admit it, but Li-Han was the one with the best grasp of strategy and tactics out of all the sophomores. Li-Han asked that Silence not interfere and listen to him. Overall, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Silence showed Li-Han a fist. Simon asked, is he really sure about that? Li-Han asked, why did they want to attack at once without delay? The guy answered, because of the mage's telekinetic attack and the possibility of escaping by teleport. But now they didn't have to worry about that. Simon noticed that Li-Han was right about the fire. It wasn't that long ago that Crystal had used the last charge. But why was he so sure that the mage wouldn't teleport out of here? Li-Han replied that for over 10 years these monsters have been hiding and lurking, but they haven't left. Now their lives were in danger, but they were still here. The magician tried to destroy them with the remaining energy from the crystal. He had his subordinates go back to his place instead of going after the humans in pursuit because he needs protection. That means that the ability to teleport simply isn't there. There must be a reason why he can't leave this place. Li-Han continued to tell his plan. All 3 of them, including the injured sergeant, listened to him attentively. Silence and Simon looked at each other. They agreed with Li-Han's reasoning. What should they do next? Li-Han stood in front of the cliff and held the modified airboards in his hands. Li-Han said that he would catch Ella's magician. To do so, our hero decided to ambush him from the side of the crevasse. Li-Han told Simon and Silence that they will distract the enemies from the front. The mage can sense their telekinesis energy. However, if the energy comes from the side of the crack, merging with its flow, it will be difficult to determine the source. The light from the crack should blind the mage. Simon said that this light would blind Li-Han, among others. In addition, everyone could feel the pressure from the crack. Could Li-Han operate the egg boards under such conditions? Simon added that a mistake would cost Li-Han his life. Li-Han replied that he was confident in his control. Li-Han said that he decided to catch the mage himself, not because he feels guilty, but because he has the best chance of success. No matter how hard it was for our hero now, he felt confident and hoped for the support of his comrades. Simon thought that Li-Han must have seen his squad members in that group. Sometimes he looks like a machine, just as cold. And if he didn't feel anything after everything he saw, it's hard to call him human at all. But even in a situation where things didn't go according to plan because of him, he managed to keep his composure and make a plan for the next attack. That was amazing. It was now clear why the 13th squad trusted Li-Han unconditionally. Li-Han thought, good thing he got there in time. The guy dropped his helmet with the night vision device mounted on it into the slot. He was holding the airboards in his hands. Li-Han thought once more that a mistake would cost him his life. Simon said the timer went off. 15 minutes had already passed. Li-Han gave the command for them to start. He threw the boards into the crevice and jumped after them. Li-Han was descending down the cleft in free fall. 2 boards flew in front of him, on which he placed his feet. Silence was approaching Mega Ella. He was followed on his heels by Simon. Simon was very surprised to see that the magician was surrounded by warriors. Why were there so many of them? All of the magician's guards had come here to protect the master. Silence, without stopping, charged into the battle. He began to hit the enemy warriors very effectively while trying to get closer to the mage. Simon carried out a fire attack. Silence worked effectively on the enemy. With balls, bloody splatters were flying in different directions. At the same time, Simon, using his automatic weapon, kept up with the efficiency of damaging the enemy. Simon thought about making sure that Li Han did his part and didn't screw up this plan. They can't fail their first combat mission. At this time, Li Han was climbing up on the airboards from the crevice. He was counting on the surprise factor. As he climbed up, Li Han experienced that overwhelming feeling again. Something was pressing heavily on him. The guy was sure that this feeling was caused by the dragon's fear. Quite clearly, at some point, Li Han saw a huge dragon face with glowing eyes in front of him. However, it shouldn't be here. Li Han realized that it was an illusion. One had to make a decision and move on. To distract himself from the feeling of fear, Li Han bit his finger until it bled. Li Han continued forward straight into the illusory dragon's mouth. He felt that the mission shouldn't be failed, even more so because of his fear. Effectively attacking the enemies, Simon noted that there were only 2 guards left. Where was Li Han? Ella's mage was facing the attackers. Behind his back was a cleft from which a bright light was emanating. Here were the mage's attackers being protected by the guards. Simon thought that the guards would protect the mage and not attack. Simon took aim. The mage, looking him in the eye, activated the guard's defense with the crystal. Simon fired several shots, but the guards were unharmed. The bullets ricocheted off to the side. Simon realized that thanks to the mage, the guards had a shield. They realized where he was aiming. It was the perfect defense. None of the defenders noticed Li Han's shadow emerge from the crevice, out of the stream of light. Li Han was stealthily approaching Ella's mage. After all, the opponents could only see those in front of them. In his hand, the guy had a syringe with an antidote that he must use against the magician. Li Han stealthily got close to the magician and grabbed him by the neck. A loud scream sounded out. The mage held the rod with the crystal in his hand and wouldn't let go. The guards looked around and saw that their leader was in danger. They turned around and rushed to his aid. At that moment, Simon and Silence attacked them. Li Han stuck the syringe needle into the mage's neck and injected the entire contents. As the amount of liquid in the syringe decreased, Li Han tensely thought that, in the worst-case scenario, the mage would teleport away. However, that didn't happen. The magician's movements indicated that he was weakening. His eyes were still glowing. The expression on his face said that he was beginning to give up. Li Han didn't loosen his grip for a moment, pressing his opponent tighter and tighter against him. At some point, it seemed to our hero that the mage was teleporting. The density of his body began to change critically. Would they really lose him? However, in the next moment, the mage lost consciousness. His body became as before, but collapsed, and the mage hung on Li Han's arms. The guy realized that they had succeeded. Li Han stood silently in the hospital room above the sergeant's bed. Sarge lay with a bandaged limb. John Red had told the cadet not to stand over him like a dog to be led to the bushes. Prosthetic limbs were still on the table. He'll get disability pay. It's time for discharge. And there's no need to apologize again. The sergeant added that sticking to the plan was the right decision Li Han had made. If he had backed off, his leg would have gotten upset and cried. Thanks to Li Han, he had finished the operation report. Now it was left to find out the details from the captured mage. Li Han asked if they could interrogate the alien from another world. The sergeant said the ARC has a telepathy specialist, the only one in the world. John Red took out a cigar to smoke. Li Han thought, what is he doing? This is a hospital room. The door to the ward opened and Silence appeared on the doorstep. The sergeant said that they had finished talking, so Silence could enter. Silence used a gadget to inquire about Sarge's well-being. John Red replied that he used to think about going on a diet, but now there was no need. He had lost a good amount of weight as it was. Silence laughed in response. Li Han noticed this. The sergeant and Silence, looking into each other's eyes, laughed. Li Han couldn't believe it. Sergeant Red could chat quietly with Silence, one of the few. Sergeant Red said the old man and the pseudo-ninja can leave his ward. He's going to mourn his lost leg and have a lot to think about. After the two left the ward, Silence apologized for hitting him. He would have done the same thing if he were in his shoes. Li Han replied that he deserved it. After all, because of him, the entire squad was in danger. Silence said that they made it through because of Li Han. Now it was clear why the sergeant had such high hopes for him. Li Han replied that he didn't think Sergeant Red would say that he liked anyone. Li Han added that Sarge always insults everyone. Silence laughed again in response. The young men parted ways. They wished each other good luck, and each left in the direction of their training building. Silence was typing a message on a gadget to send to Li Han. Li Han sensed it and looked back. Silence, while moving away, showed the message. He told the guy to study well, be obedient, and go to the 3rd year. At that, he traditionally showed the interlocutor the middle finger. At the airport, passengers got off the passenger plane. There were a lot of people. It was a whole diplomatic delegation. One of the guests was James Ryu, the U.S. representative. He noted that it was quite hot here. The airport security service met the guests. A military officer reported to Chief of Staff Alexander Lecour that the highest inspection commission had arrived. Lecour ordered to make sure they got to the main conference room safely. The military saluted the commission representatives and thanked them in unison for coming such a long way. Each of the new arrivals was given a personal wearable gadget from the ARC for prompt communication and information. The military officer said it was necessary to wear these devices so that the commission representatives would not get lost. The devices also have a localized map of the area built into them. James Ryu immediately turned on music on the gadget and said that was enough for him. The military officer told the inspector that he would walk him to his car. Mr. Ryu replied that he would get there himself, as he had the right to do so. The military man replied that he didn't mind, and thought that this Mr. Ryu would be a pain in the ass. The inspector decided that the military man wouldn't tell him anything useful anyway, and would just talk the whole way to entertain him. After scratching the back of his head, James Ryu stopped and said he had one question. He was wondering where Li Han was right now. Kuro, Jose, and Knut, with baby sweets in their hands and smiles on their faces, welcomed the guest. The guest said he was glad to meet the 13th squad. James Ryu said that these sweets were meant for the cadets. The guest turned out to be Inspector James Ryu. He had Li Han standing behind him. The inspector stated that these guys looked like his nephews. Li Han apologized to the inspector and said that they needed to continue training. Mr. Ryu replied that he would not interfere. Li Han lined up the personnel and said that they would now proceed to the firing range. The inspector thought that their commander was the same Li Han. Judging from the first year's information, the guy was nothing special. He was the talk of the town after the team battles and the massacre near the fissure. The entire time the training session was going on, the U.S. inspector was waiting outside the training ground. After the events at the crack, there was no competition and the other squads relaxed, but these guys kept practicing. Finally, the inspector noticed that the cadets had left the range. The training was over. Li Han announced that the squad would now proceed to the weapons complex. Each of the cadets had a firearm. As he looked at the squad, Inspector James Ryu thought that their persistence was enviable. In the melee hall, the inspector continued to observe this squad. Li Han said that Kuro would be training with him today. The cadets stood against each other with spears in their hands. Li Han said for Kuro not to stand like a statue and attack. Kuro thought, why did Li Han choose to pair him up? After all, he usually had other tasks. This wasn't like their usual training. Li Han felt that that battle at the spatial fissure had taught him something important. In a real battle, telekinesis alone wasn't enough. Kuro must definitely learn all the techniques of combat. Kuro was weak in his first year, but now their bodies were in great shape. It was as if they were made of metal. Li Han gave the command and said that they were starting. Kuro, obeying his commander's order, went to attack. His brain was already boiling. Why was he doing this? Kuro was definitely trying to use his unique telekinesis abilities in this training battle as well. Li Han thrust his spear forward to repel his opponent's attack. After waiting for his opponent to approach, Li Han counterattacked Kuro. Kuro, not realizing what he was doing, began to defend himself intensely. Kuro thought that he was choking very hard. How could he not die? Li Han wasn't going to stop practicing. Li Han, without slowing down his pace, continued to attack his opponent. Kuro was forced to continue defending himself. At one point, the opponent's spear stopped right in front of Kuro's face. Li Han said that even if he could see the future, he couldn't win just by defending himself. The commander said for Kuro to try to attack him after all. Kuro was once again confused. Closing his eyes and shouting, Kuro still put his spear forward and attacked Li Han. Kuro's spear was knocked out of his opponent's hands and flew high up. Kuro cried out in surprise. Obviously, his attack had failed. Li Han told Kuro to keep his eyes open when he hit and to hold the spear tighter. Kuro looked guiltily at his opponent and apologized. He made it clear that he would try harder. Li Han said that Kuro should attack him as hard as he could this time. Even Jose and Knut stopped their training and paid attention to those words. They too were curious about what would follow. Kuro picked up his spear from the floor and stood in indecision, looking at his commander with wide eyes. Li Han, sternly looking straight into his opponent's eyes, said that he would use his abilities to the maximum and urged Kuro to do the same. Jose remarked that judging by the way they held their weapons, Lee Han would win. Knut remarked that if telekinesis is taken into account, the odds are evened out. Lee Han, smiling, asked if Kuro was afraid to scratch him. Kuro replied that he didn't know why the commander was acting like that, but he was sure he had a reason. With a change in his face, Kuro added that he knows because he knows the commander and he will do as he said. Kuro began to glow under the influence of his telekinesis. He said that he believed Lee Han. After training, the instructor offered Lee Han a cup of hot tea and asked him what brought him here. Wei Cheng said that it was a very delicious oolong tea, the cadet should like it. Lee Han said it was very tasty and thanked him. He thought to himself what kind of drink it was. Wei Cheng thought it was funny. These cadets can already pretend at their age. Lee Han said he came here because he was very worried about Kuro. Lee Han said that because of his fear, he lacks pressure and aggression in battle. He is afraid that it might cost him his life. Wei Cheng, taking another sip of tea, said that people change their psychological distance, depending on what weapons they are working with. Lee Han thought, what kind of phrase is psychological distance? It's the inner resistance when it comes to harming another. It can be difficult for a soldier to destroy an enemy with his bare hands, but he can easily do it with a bomb. The instructor said it's hard for Kuro to hit and destroy on command. He needs a stronger reason than just someone's words. Wei Cheng recalled, for example, like back then on the island when Kuro believed in Lee Han. Kuro continued to glare under the influence of his telekinesis. He said that he believed Lee Han. Lee Han realized what psychological distance was. Knut and Jose remarked that Kuro seemed to have lost his mind. He doesn't look like himself. Maybe we should stop them. James Ryu continued to watch this training session. He thought it was amazing. He now understood what A-class power meant. Lee Han thought that it was simply amazing. So how should he proceed? Wouldn't it be too much for Kuro? Jose said that Kuro could anticipate Lee Han's attack and dodge. Knut noticed that it was impossible to dodge and approach at the same time. While dodging Kuro's attack, Lee Han thought that the strength level of his opponent's telekinesis was the same as that with which he threw the spear with just his hands. Knut suggested that Lee Han would catch the coffee rather than dodge. Jose added that not everyone could do that. Lee Han noticed that Kuro only threw one spear. Is he really afraid to attack normally? Kuro hadn't decided what he wanted to do yet. He stood there pensive. Lee Han, smiling, said that Kuro would have to attack him after all, exactly with the spear he was holding. Lee Han shouted that he was attacking, and thrusting his spear forward, he moved to attack. Kuro gathered his courage and stretched his arm forward, using his telekinetic abilities to try and block the attacker's attack. As he approached, Lee Han said that Kuro's spears were few and far between. It was necessary to use them wisely. There was no time left, and Kuro aimed all the spears at the same time towards his opponent. Lee Han was subjected to a massive attack. Lee Han threw off his jacket and threw it over the flying spears. After that, he turned around and changed his position. Jose wondered, was Lee Han really trying to cover himself with his jacket? Knut shouted for Kuro to make his spear longer. Kuro lunged towards his opponent with the spear he was holding. Lee Han managed to dodge. At some point, the opponents were close to each other. Their gazes met, and they looked at each other point blank. Lee Han noticed that there was no fear in his opponent's eyes. Jokingly, Lee Han gave Kuro a flick. Kuro ducked his head. Lee Han thanked Kuro for not clinching, though. Kuro had his hand on his bruised forehead. The cheerleaders cheered. Jose said it was brutal. Knut noted that it was a battle without tears or blood. Lee Han said Kuro was too soft. Lee Han asked when Kuro threw all the spears at him, why did he only aim at the body? After all, he could have aimed them at different parts of his body, and it would have been harder to dodge. Definitely some would have hit his arms or legs. Kuro said that he couldn't endanger the commander, and added that he didn't expect Lee Han to use his jacket as a shield. Inspector Ryu thought the rumors were deceptive. Lee Han is actually tougher than the stories about him. He's sure that this guy will be able to tell what the ARC leadership is keeping quiet about. Inspector Ryu came down to the set and asked if Lee Han could spare 1 minute. Lee Han and Inspector Ryu stepped out into the fresh air. Hearing the question, Lee Han clarified if he was referring to the events that happened at the spatial fissure. Lee Han said that he had already said everything about it, and it was reflected in the report. James Ryu handed the guy a can of drink and said that he was interested in hearing from him personally about what happened there and how he acted. James Ryu took a seat on the bench and suggested that Lee Han do the same. They have time and they're in no hurry to go anywhere. Lee Han thought that he should be careful not to say anything unnecessary. The inspector had a superpower to help support the interlocutor. If James Ryu agreed with a person at the right moment or supported his action, the person would relax and start telling things he didn't intend to. Now, in this conversation, Inspector Ryu hoped to elicit something from the young man that he had not told before. James Ryu said he was almost there. In the course of the conversation, he asked the boy, "And what happened next?" Lee Han was surprised. "What next are we talking about?" The inspector was discouraged. This guy had told the same thing that was written in the report. Was there really nothing further? Lee Han added that there were some minor details that could be read about in the report. James Ryu noted that this guy's facial expression didn't even change. Wasn't he crazy? Lee Han saluted Spectre and said that it was time for him to proceed to training. The personnel were already waiting for him. As he parted, Lee Han thought that he was forbidden to talk about the Whiskey Squad, regardless of the conditions. The inspector's efforts to influence him were unsuccessful. At that moment, a telephone call rang out, which James Ryu was forced to answer. After speaking to the caller, the inspector said to check whether Lee Han had been at the ARC from the time the crack was formed until today. Lee Han and his squad, as always, ran around the circle in the allotted time. Cadets of other squads ran alongside. Petrov caught up with our hero again. He said that Lee Han was full of energy as always. Lee Han replied that he could say the same about Dmitri. Petrov said that he should keep himself in shape. He pointed out the inspector standing next to him and said that the man was from Russia. Petrov added that this guy has been following them around for a few days now. He's clearly getting on his nerves. He says he has to fight for the sake of his homeland and all that. Lee Han asked, "After the war with the dragon and other monsters, who is there to fight against? The ARC will be disbanded when they win, won't they?" Petrov seriously told Lee Han that after defeating the dragon, the top brass wanted to start a war to gain power over the entire world. Lee Han continued to train his personnel. Observing the technique of the cadets skillfully wielding spears, the commander concluded that they were really progressing. It was hard for our hero to accept that even after the victory over the most terrible enemy of mankind, peace would never come. A warrior with a machine gun in his hand against the background of explosions stands over a pile of human bones. Would this really be the reality? The door in the room swung open and Inspector James Ryu reappeared. He said that he had finally found Lee Han. Inspector Ryu found out that Lee Han hadn't been in the ARC since the Shinju incident. The cadets stopped and looked curiously at the uninvited guest. The inspector thought that Lee Han must have been on a secret mission at the time. James Ryu was approaching our hero. Mr. Ryu intended to turn this simple conjecture into an indisputable fact today. The inspector did not appear alone. He was accompanied by stern-looking men in black. James Ryu decided, even if it was necessary, to lightly intimidate the guy. The cadets looked at their gadgets at the same time. They had all received a message. It turned out to be a message from their commanding officer. He relayed the command to not use voice. The next second, Lee Han twisted the hands of Inspector Ryu, who approached him. The man was indignant. "How do you even understand this?" The men in black reacted accordingly. They immediately pulled out firearms from their inner pockets, trying to protect their boss if necessary. Kuro didn't hesitate and used his telekinesis to disassemble these guys' weapons into small pieces. In the next moment, these men screamed in pain. Their fingers were twisted in an unnatural way. Lee Han said that from now on, Inspector James Ryu would be under their supervision. The inspector was indignant. The guy has no such authority. Lee Han said they had their orders. The inspector must not resist. James Ryu didn't realize what was going on. Suddenly, there was a loud sound from outside and the building shook. All the cadets received an emergency message. There was an unexpected attack. It is necessary to detain and guard the inspectors if they are around. Inspector Ryu thought that this couldn't be. Was there really a traitor among the inspectors? Lee Han said that the inspector would be with Jose. Kyo and Knut should bring firearms immediately. Kuro was frightened. Who had attacked? Was it really Ella? Lee Han replied that it was probably people who attacked. He continued to hold Inspector Ryu back. Inspector James Ryu and his men sat on the gym floor with their hands tied. The cadets brought out assault rifles and handed them out to everyone. Lee Han said that each would take 2 magazines. The total would be 60 rounds each. Lee Han asked his colleagues from other squads how many people were in charge of defense. There were different answers from different squads. Some had 2 people, some had 4. James Ryu thought that the leaders of the other squads were calmly accepting Lee Han's instructions as if he was in charge. However, there was nothing to be surprised about. His experience and accomplishments spoke for themselves. Lee Han thought that the place they were in now would only play to their advantage. He gave the command for all the squads to gather at the 4th battleground. all weapons possible to carry must be taken with them. The 13th squad with the prisoners proceeded to their destination, moving cautiously and looking around. Li-Han asked the captured inspector if he knew anything about the attackers. The moment the inspector saw the message, Li-Han thought he knew something. Besides, he didn't think the traitor was Mr. James Ryu. The inspector said it was the purists. Mr. Ryu added that's what they call themselves. They are a group of radicals whose members do not consider people like everyone here as human beings. The purists want to exterminate everyone. They are driven by religious beliefs, as well as fear of a new kind of people with inexplicable powers. Knut said that in 3 years, they will be attacked by dragons. Don't the purists want to help with that? The inspector replied that the purists are convinced that the dragons will come specifically because of the AR key. So their logic is simple: no telepaths, no invasion. Knut countered that this is sheer nonsense. People with superpowers appeared only after the gate was opened. A helicopter with terrorists circled above them. One of them shouted that he had found it, a bunch of people who were in the way of Providence. The helicopters began dropping bombs on those below. In response, fire was opened on the helicopters with the terrorists. The fire was aimed, and some of the aircraft were destroyed. The ARC armed representatives moved cautiously across the field, preparing for a possible terrorist landing. That's exactly what happened. Li-Han and his team, armed with small arms, assumed that the fighting was about to begin. The 13th squad was cautiously advancing through the deserted neighborhood. Not far from them, an enemy helicopter crashed. Li-Han, addressing his cadets, said that there was a high probability that the enemy had survived. There were about 4 people on board. Li-Han wanted to go through the 4th battle range because there was a place to take cover. He would like to avoid a direct confrontation. Li-Han said in a serious voice for all the guys to get ready. What they are about to do now will be a first time for them. It's not a training session now. This is a serious clash. This is going to be a real destruction of the enemy. The terrorists have been located. The cadets opened fire to kill them. Due to the fact that the criminals were taken by surprise, they did not have time to put up a decent resistance. One of the terrorists was destroyed on the spot, while the other attempted to return fire. The villain shouted to his rival that the Earth belongs to humans, and there is no place for freaks like them here. Inspector James Ryu looked around and assessed the situation. He figured that most of the people around him were of little use right now. Perhaps only one would be useful. Li-Han said for Knut to follow him. The inspector, looking after the departing Li-Han, thought that these guys are much stronger than the purists, because terrorists don't have that kind of training. But there is one important difference. Purists are much more used to destroying people. Li-Han asked his comrade if he was confident. Would he be able to do it? Knut replied that he would pretend to hunt deer. Here, either they destroy or they destroy. Unpleasant memories surfaced in our hero's mind. The capital of an Asian nation, a child running away from a man. Li-Han runs away with a bag of apples. An angry man chases after him. There's a railroad crossing up ahead. The barrier is lowered. Li-Han runs under the barrier without stopping. The man grabbed the child by the scruff of the neck. The apples from the bag went flying in different directions. Li-Han resists. The man pulls him towards him. The confrontation takes place on the railroad tracks. The train is very close. The driver gives the men light and sound signals. Li-Han turns around and kicks the man in the face. In front of the child, the man is hit by the train. Li-Han, sitting on the ground next to him, screams in fear. A red apple lies beside him. It's pouring rain. Li-Han and Knut see a burning helicopter crashing into a house. The young men keep quiet. Li-Han pulls out his airboard. Li-Han decided to do one trick. He threw his jacket over the airboard and it peeked out from around the corner. A machine gun line sounded. The jacket was being shot at by terrorists. The villain never realized what it was. What was he shooting at? From behind him, an armed Knut appeared above his head. The shredded jacket fell and only the airboard remained in the air. The terrorist realized he had been tricked. At that moment, the Knut opened fire to kill and destroy the enemy. Another terrorist jumped out from around the corner. The villain, who saw Knut crouching over his destroyed opponent, intended to open fire. However, he was shot in the head. From behind cover, Li-Han looked out and fired the decisive shot. The whip with a machine gun in his hand said he had to make sure because the terrorist was still alive. The gazes of the cadet and the villain met, Knut thought, only to squirm with fear. Knut once again opened fire to kill his opponent. Li-Han, coming up behind him, called out to his comrade. Knut replied that he was fine. Kuro, Jose, Kiyo, and the arrested inspector and his men stood waiting. The inspector looked at Kuro and saw that the guy was shaking with fear. James Ryu didn't think he would be able to attack. However, where was he looking at all the time? The inspector managed to discreetly cut the ropes, binding his hands. It was to his advantage that Kuro was constantly looking away. Kuro said fearfully that they were close. The inspector was at a loss. Who is close? Kuro didn't know if they should open fire. An armed terrorist appeared from around the corner. He spotted the men. Kuro spotted him first and shouted for everyone to get down immediately. Kujo prepared his automatic rifle to repel the attack. Inspector Ryu immediately ducked down. Inspector Ryu snatched the assault rifle from the cadet and fired at the terrorist who appeared. It happened very quickly. No one had time to realize it. The destroyed terrorist fell down and the automatic rifle remained in James Ryu's possession. A bewildered Kuro stood with his bare hands. The assault rifle that had ended up in James Ryu's possession was Kuro's. A shadow appeared from the window opening of a neighboring house. Kuro noticed it first. He managed to create a protective energy shield in front of him and the inspector. The inspector immediately reacted and opened fire, shooting at the terrorist in the window. James Ryu asked Kuro, "Was that the last terrorist?" Kuro confusedly replied that yes. The inspector added that the guy didn't seem to know how to shoot, but he was good with telekinesis. After a moment, Lee Han and Knut came running in, wondering what had happened. James Ryu gave Kuro his machine gun and raised his hands. He said that Lee Han was a smart guy and had already figured it out himself. Lee Han was speechless and said to leave. The terrorists, advancing forward, came to an underground hangar. The gate of the hangar was open and smoke was coming out. The leader said the rats had left their hole. The terrorist commander gave the order, "Leave no one behind, destroy everyone." The villain raised his hand with the machine gun up and shouted that the Ark was deceiving everyone. There would be no dragon attack. The man with the bandage on his face added that all the dragons disappeared 10 years ago. An army of telepaths is not needed to save the world. The terrorist added that telepaths are needed to take over the world. These children will grow up, develop abilities, and enslave everyone. Before entering the hangar, the terrorist announced that they were starting a purge in the name of humanity. Training Battlefield Number 4. The area contained the cadets who had managed to get here. Lee Han and his team were moving in the same direction. Our hero had confidence and composure on his face. All of the sophomores were in formation. One of the inspectors with his hands tied was cursing loudly. Do these cadets even realize who the inspectors are? Do they really think they can get away with this? Simon grabbed the inspector's chest and told him that if he didn't shut up, he would be the first one to be killed here. Doesn't he understand why they are doing this? Simon yelled that there was a traitor among the instructors who had set this whole thing up. Simon added that he had to destroy a man because of that rascal. He had never felt so disgusted with himself. The shouting inspector immediately fell silent and didn't utter another word. Lee Han, who had come over, told Simon to calm down. They must not only find the traitor, but also protect the ordinary inspectors. Simon and Lee Han stood side by side. In front of them were the inspectors with their hands tied. The most shouty of them was on his knees. Jose thought that Del Simon himself was calmly obeying Lee Han's orders. This is something unbelievable. The first-year weapons training center. Wei Cheng is negotiating with a captured terrorist. He grabbed him by the throat and lifted him up. The terrorist confessed all his sins and repented. Wei Cheng let him go and the villain fell to the floor. The inspector learned the shocking truth. The freshmen standing nearby were very frightened. The wounded inspector, with his head down, was deciding what action to take. The frightened cadets were subject to panic. Wei Cheng tried to contact Lee Han through a gadget. Lee Han and the other cadets had already rushed over to help. Wei Cheng said that the terrorists were heading towards the freshmen. The enemy is heading towards the shelter. Judging from the map, Lee Han and his team are the only ones around to stop them. Wei Cheng is counting on Lee Han's help for now. Lee Han thought that now, in addition to the inspectors, they need to ensure the safety of the freshmen. If they were even a minute late, there would be no one to save. Wei Cheng took the first fire on himself. The terrorists, upon seeing the inspector, opened fire to kill. The group of terrorists looked around. The inspector was lying in front of them, covered in blood. There were corridors diverging in different directions. The villain said that he was sick of this maze. Over the radio, the terrorists received information that their colleagues had found the door. They asked how the other squads were doing. There was a report that the search for the cadets was continuing. The enemy was hiding in the rear when they entered the hideout. A group of terrorists at the entrance of the shelter encountered the approaching cadets. It was Lee Han's squad. Lee Han shouted that they should attack the enemies first. Lee Han said that none of them had serious weapons. Would Simon be able to block? Simon said he was about to show something else. His eyes blazed furiously, and he said for everyone to attack on his command. Lihan shouted to his squad that Simon would lead them next. Everyone followed him. The terrorists opened fire on the approaching cadets. Simon was in the lead. Simon created a protective energy field and shouted to his comrades to open fire. The terrorists didn't realize what was happening. Their shots didn't reach the target. However, the opponent was hitting with aim and destroying the villains. Lihan and Knut approached the barely moving terrorist. The lying villain said with his last strength that these cadets were real monsters. The terrorist added that these people should have been wiped off the face of the earth long ago. Knut used his machine gun to silence the terrorist and said that there are no monsters here besides these villains. Lihan told Knut to calm down and take his ammunition. There are more terrorists inside the hideout. Lihan said he gathered everyone into a group because he sees they have similar personalities. Lihan said he still feels guilty that he gave into his emotions and the sergeant got hurt. However, it won't happen again. From now on, everyone must keep their feelings under control. If even one fails, everyone will be in danger. The leader said that they know the area better than the terrorists, and even if they take this position, there shouldn't be any problems. Lihan said that the heads should go to the points indicated on the diagram with their squads. Petrov said his deputy is in charge for now. He wants to do something, but it's very risky. Petrov added that he wants to test a thought. Lihan said that's fine with him. On the doorstep of the psychiatric ward lay shot people in blood. Petrov, with an automatic rifle behind his back, saw a third-year student in front of him with whom he had a conflict. The shot bodies lay on the floor between them. The senior student turned around and asked what Dmitri was doing. Petrov replied that his interlocutor was holding one of their men. Petrov told the guy to wake up. The senior student was indeed holding one of the ARC officers by the collar. He asked in surprise, did Dmitri really think the ARC was on their side? The guy added that he didn't know if Dmitri knew, but as soon as they were transferred to the third year, they were immediately sent into real combat. On one of his missions, he was completely consumed by fear and helplessness. He felt his instincts and intuition screaming that they will never defeat this. Petrov thought it was the dragon's fear. The senior student dismissed the mental health officer and said that the ARC was still ordering them to fight something like this. The guy added